Okay. Good evening.
Excuse me.
Good evening. All right. Okay. Okay. This is sorry, my name's Councillor Alistair Neal, and this is a meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee on Wednesday, the 4th of October 2023. I just read the preamble here about our role in Overview and Scrutiny. So the role of Overview and Scrutiny is to provide an independent, critical friend challenge and to work with the Council's executive and other public service providers for the benefit of the public. The committee considers submissions from a range of sources and reaches conclusions based on the weight of evidence, not on party political grounds. So, very much. And also this meeting may be filmed for inclusion on the council's website. Please note that other people may film, record, tweet or blog from this meeting. The use of these images or recordings is not under the council's control. Okay, so first off, apologies for absence.
Apologies from Alison Swaddle, and Graham Howe is here as a substitute, Chair.
Okay, thanks. All right, so then minutes of the previous meeting. Has anyone got any comments about the minutes of the previous meeting? Pauline.
Just like to thank the clerk for the change to the minutes that's in there from the last time, from the previous time. That's very accurate.
Okay, thank you. So would someone like to propose the minutes of the previous meeting? Andrew, who would like to second? Norman? Okay, we vote to agree that the minutes are a correct record. It's passed. Okay, thank you. So, declarations. Declarations of interest. Have we got any declarations of interest? No. Good. Public questions.
There are no public questions and no member questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you. So move on to agenda item 40, a vision for our borough. And we have Leader of Council Stephen Conway. And we've got Jackie Whitney online and Louise Livingston online.
Thank you very much, Shal, and I'm very pleased that Jackie and Louise are here. I'm sure they will be able to help field any questions you might have about this agenda item. You've been provided with the slides in your agenda, and I'm going to make the rather radical assumption that you've looked at them and therefore not go through them and explain them all to you. I really just wanted to say a few words in introduction and then try and field any questions you have. I want to thank you first of all for inviting me to update the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee on progress on the community vision. Last week I attended a meeting of the Community Vision Steering Group, which is made up of representatives from business, the voluntary sector, health providers, faith groups, the university and the youth council, as well as council officers. The leaders of the different political parties have a standing invitation to attend, and the steering group's very ably chaired by Nick Fellows of the Wokingham Volunteer Centre. After a lot of work with the different stakeholders, we now want to involve the wider community and seek their views on priorities. Our Engage platform is being used to promote 2 questionnaires, one short and very punchy one, and one somewhat more detailed. They're now on Engage and will be there until the 6th of November. And we've already begun to speak with community groups and use other forms of gathering views. One example that we use in some of the events that officers and councillors attend is this postcard, which invites those involved to reflect on 3 questions. What do you like about the area where you live? What would you like to change about the area where you live? If you were describing the place where you live in the future, what would you want to say about it? So these are all very open-ended and not leading questions in any way. The challenge, of course, when you have a questionnaire that encourages free text responses as opposed to option A, option B, option C, tick, is that you then have to analyse all of that narrative and then try and draw out of it some major themes that are common across the piece. And we're very lucky that Reading University, which is heavily involved in this process, last week's meeting was at the university. Reading University has offered some help in analysing the data once we've completed the process of collecting it. I want to thank Jackie Whitney, who's here with us this evening, and her officer colleagues for all the work they're putting in to make sure that the process of community engagement moves forward. And I want to thank also all the steering group members for giving up their time and showing great commitment to making this a genuinely co-authored community vision. And this is, I think, what completely differentiates it from what has been attempted in the past. There have been attempts to engage the wider community before, but not to create a co-authored community vision. And the enthusiasm and creativity of the steering groups, incredibly inspiring, and it demonstrates what can be achieved by working in a true partnership of equals. Now, the report this evening also relates to the council plan. The current plan expires in 2024, and we're proposing to extend it into 2025, by which time the community vision work should be complete, so it can then form the central plank of the new council plan. I think that's probably all I need to say by way of introduction, but either Jackie or Louise or I can try and answer any questions that you've got.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. So, yeah, have we got any questions then from the floor? Starting with Andrew then.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Stephen, for the introduction, and thank you to everybody, not only officers, but the much wider community, who've been involved in this very impressive project thus far. As Stephen explained, and I can see this myself, I believe that this is something that's not only very different in process, but also very different in substance. And I think this is a very, very exciting project for us all to be involved with. And thank you also for the opportunity for our committee to be involved at this stage in our overview function. I thought, just before I make some very specific suggestions, as to how, this might be developed further, perhaps. I did want to note the example that Stephen mentioned a moment ago of the collaborative approach and the buy-in, of the wider community. And the example that Stephen gave, of course, was University of Reading's offer, if I've understood it correctly, to be involved in supporting the analysis, of the consultation, responses. And this is exactly, the type of collaborative, work, partnership working, that I believe that is a benefit to all. So I hope I'm conveying my enthusiasm, for this. I would like to offer just a few observations, that may or may not, be sort of helpful taking this further. It seems to me, the first observation is that it seems to me that in the current iteration, which I must say is excellent, the presentation that we've been given tonight, I think is incredibly professional and very, very clear indeed. Okay, but it does seem to me that we're missing explicit reference to the external environment. For example, maybe this is perhaps not the best example to give at this point, but influence of government. In this process. In particular, though, ways in which we might be able to sort of lobby, work with, tap into government sort of resources, and so forth in this process. A better example, though, is explicit reference to opportunities for working collaboratively, with neighbouring local authorities. And I'd really like to suggest, that we perhaps try to build that in more explicitly, into the documentation. I note on the governance diagram on page 23, and again, very clear diagram. Thank you very much. It does include, down the right-hand side, reference to the steering group representation. Now, I'm assuming that that is quite fluid, okay? I might be wrong, okay, but I would hope, that it's something that, will remain fluid. There are a couple of things, though, that I would suggest with this iteration, and that is that there should be, rather than leader of named political groups, it should just be leaders of political parties, okay, rather than the current format there, so that it is inclusive, of all. And I would also like to suggest that local environmental and active travel groups, of whom we have a number, who've got a lot to contribute in our community, could be added or considered for addition. I do have I was really pleased, okay, to hear a moment ago that the consultation will be seeking residents' views and other stakeholders' views about priorities, because there's definitely a need, for clear and effective, prioritization. So I'm really pleased, to hear that, and that this is going to begin almost immediately, I think, if I've understood correctly, via the Engage programme. I think also, though, that it's important also to be very clear, about the importance of sequencing of activities. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is priorities will not necessarily mesh neatly, with what might be best in terms of the most efficient sequencing, ordering, of activities, and so. And I think it'd be good to address that, at a very early stage, and also. And I'm sure that this is already being done, but to look for explicit examples of synergies and how these can be exploited to their fullest. In other words, that we're able to achieve something that's much greater than just the sum of the parts, because there must be massive opportunities for synergies, I think here. And I will end with a question, because I'm aware I've said quite a lot. I apologise, but my concern is I'm just really pleased, in this presentation to see explicit reference, for example, to the involvement of youth, in the process. Wonderful descriptions about the governance and so forth. My question is, how are we envisaging that we will be able to ensure that there will be continued and meaningful engagement, of all of the stakeholders? I'm sure there's an awful lot of goodwill. Well, it's already been demonstrated, hasn't it? And what we must do, is to ensure that, we continue to build on that, develop it, further, because it is very easy sometimes, inadvertently, for sometimes just with particular groups, and so forth, to kind of wane, in the process. So I guess if there is a question there, it's, any ideas, on how that might be addressed? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, you made a lot of points, some of which I would like to respond to before I come to your question. Obviously, the council is always seeking to make sure that it takes full advantage of whatever resources are available externally, and that includes, of course, from central government. Your point about collaborative working with neighbouring authorities is really important. And it's certainly one we're very aware of. Thankfully, we are establishing a good working relationship with all of the other Berkshire unitaries through the Berkshire Leaders group. The environment or the atmosphere in those meetings is apparently radically different from how it was even a year ago. Partly that's personalities, and partly that's political changes, I'm sure. But the upshot is there is a good working relationship and an appetite to collaborate wherever that's appropriate. Reading Borough Council have embarked on something not dissimilar to this, and you'll see in the agenda slides there's reference to a lot of councils that have gone down this route. And obviously, it's always a good idea to look what other councils are doing and see whether we can learn from that. And we are certainly doing that here. On your point about who should be involved in the steering group, certainly I take your point entirely about wanting to make sure that this was open to leaders of all political parties. Perhaps it's slightly misleading. This list of people who are involved is not a list that has been determined by the council. It's a list of people who volunteered to be involved. So it's a list of people who volunteered or who have appeared at those steering groups and shown an interest in being involved. So these are not conscripts; they're volunteers. And on that basis, you'll understand why there may be some gaps. So you mentioned environmental groups, active travel groups. It would be wonderful if we can get somebody involved from those groups and many other groups. And we will be continuing to try and encourage people to join the steering group. Yes, you're absolutely right. Sequencing is going to be a challenge, and we've got to try and address that. You're absolutely right that we are discovering simply through this process of engaging with people on the community vision, we're discovering all sorts of possible connections and ways in which we can develop partnership working completely separately from the community vision. So we're uncovering quite a lot of connections that exist between groups that we didn't really know about, which we're now able to become involved in. So it is already more than the sum of the parts in many ways, and it is helping to promote wider partnership working, which is very important to the council. It's something I very strongly believe we have to embrace, because I think in a world of limited resources, it's vital for the council to think creatively about how it can rise to the challenges we're facing and are likely to continue facing. Whatever happens, I can't see a world where local government is adequately funded. So we're always going to have to be thinking about how we pool resources, how we pool knowledge, data, experience to try and maximise the benefit we can bring to our community. The point about your question was really actually about continuing engagement, how we continue to keep people involved. Well, obviously, we've still got some way to go to get to the point where we get our first draft community vision and then a final draft. After that, clearly, it's going to be necessary periodically to refresh and review the vision, because circumstances change and the vision may become outdated and in need of modification. And we can only do that by continuing the process of engagement. So it's vitally important that all those people who've shown a commitment, we keep them involved. We have had some discussions about other ways in which we can also try and engage with a group of people that would be truly representative of all of the communities and as many of the different interests within the borough as we could. And it may be that we will go down the route as a council. Eventually, we'll go down the route of exploring whether a community, I'm not sure what the word is, a community panel or a forum should be formed that actually is a way of actually just seeing whether we are doing the right things and whether it has resonance. I don't know whether Jackie wants to add anything to what I've said.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Just a couple of bits just to reassure everyone that we're reaching out as far as we possibly can. So internally, to add to the external steering group, we're leveraging contacts that we have internally as well. So we have 3 other internal groups. So we have an internal steering group made up of assistant directors from across the organisation, and they're working on steering not only the vision or the council's part of the vision, but also the council plans to make sure that they're absolutely aligned, which I'm sure Louise will fill you in on. We've also got an officer engagement group. So we know that officers across the organisation have lots of contacts with organisations like travel groups, active travel groups, etc. that you mentioned there, Andrew. So we're making sure that we leverage contacts that way as well, and we've been to various forums, managers networking session, extended corporate leadership team. We've been to programme boards, borough education partnerships to present essentially what we would love them to be involved in, so that we can leverage their contacts too. And then finally, we have a programme steering group. So the vision is part of a wider programme of work and improvement that I'm leading on across the council. And of course, again, there's many more officers involved in that. So across arts and culture, leisure, travel, as we've said, public health, children's social care. So we've got a wider group. We don't meet every month or every week. We meet bi-monthly, but we absolutely report on activity monthly, so that we can absolutely keep that aligned and leverage all of the contacts that they've got, either boards or contacts in the community. So that's kind of an additional piece of contact that we're making through those additional networks that we have there. In terms of maintaining, just finally, in terms of maintaining that contact and that involvement, and like we have now with the external steering group, as Stephen was saying, we're going to keep those contacts going beyond the vision. So once the vision has been created, obviously we would have our council plan. So we will have the part of the vision that we, as a partner in this process, will contribute to, as will our partners. They will have their own plans. But looking into the future, I see that we would meet regularly, actually, to say how we're achieving the outcomes, because it is aspirational, but actually what we have to do is meet on a regular basis to discuss how we each play that part and how we can collaboratively work to achieve some of those outcomes. So we're bringing stuff together rather than us working in a silo, if that makes sense, with our own little plans. This is about us as a collective working together. So I absolutely see that beyond, once we've got the vision, the steering group should continue as much as possible. Happy to answer any further questions.
Okay, thanks. Graham.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Given that we've got 17 parish and town councils across the piece, given that we've got a parish council liaison forum, I was wondering how effective the communication was with them, given that I sit on 2 of the parish councils, and I think we all probably sit on a parish council, but it would be interesting to get your comment as to how engaged the parish councils and town councils are.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The town and parish councils are important bodies in this process. We have engaged with the town and parish councils at various stages. They have not at present got anyone on the steering group. No one's volunteered, but we're hoping to remedy that. We're hoping to be able to encourage perhaps a councillor or councillors to join. Our engagement largely has been through the parish clerks, which is how they've wished it to be at this point. They have come to, they've sent representatives to an opening forum session where we had lots of different bodies present just to really talk through what this was going to be about and what we were hoping they would be able to do. There's been a lot of ongoing engagement with the clerks forum by our officers, but we would like to recruit parish or town councillors to join the steering group and make sure there's an input from town and parishes beyond their clerks. I think that's really important. So you raise a good point. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline?
Thank you. Thank you for the report. You've mentioned businesses, but how many and what type, or is it just the business association? Because it's quite a broad heading and it's quite a major part of Wokingham. So thank you.
It is. You're absolutely right. I won't name names because I won't remember them all, unfortunately, and that will only be embarrassing because I'm bound to miss somebody out who will feel aggrieved as a result of that. But we do have representatives from different businesses, some in Wokingham Town Centre, some in other parts of the borough. We've got associated interests from a business group that works with local charities. There's Wokingham Positive Difference. You may be aware of Wokingham Positive Difference. It's run by a very enthusiastic and rather inspirational person called Graham Hobbs. And Graham effectively runs sessions that bring together local businesses that have a sense of corporate responsibility and want to engage with the local community. And they work with local charities. So he acts, this Wokingham Positive Difference is almost like a brokerage arrangement that brings together businesses and charities. Very successfully, it's been going for some time. And Graham is associated with our work. He doesn't sit on the steering group, but he's very supportive of what we're doing and very keen to be involved in whatever way he can. So we do have, through him, connection with a lot of businesses that are very interested in this kind of community engagement and involvement. And we do have some individual businesses represented on the steering group. I mean, we've got here a category called press. But the press is, of course, a business. It's in the business of selling newspapers. And we do have Eddie Pearce on the steering group, who is very involved with the local press. And I think we've got a wide range of business involvement. In our earlier forum meetings, we did have representatives from the Chamber of Commerce and other businesses who are still keen to be engaged in this. But the commitment of time to be involved in the steering group is, quite considerable. So it's inevitable there are people who are more involved and people who are involved rather less, but still want to play a part.
Norman?
I'm just looking at the council plan side of things other than the community vision, and clearly there's a plan to have an interim sort of situation through until we get the full vision and then the 5-year plan sorted out. According to your timetable, you've got to the stage of refreshing the interim council plan. I just wonder what sorts of things are in that. Is there anything different in that from what's in the current plan? Anything new, radical? Any thoughts?
I think we took the view that we should keep the changes to a minimum because this was an interim plan simply to bridge the gap between the expiry of the current plan and wanting to launch a new one that was based on the community vision. So we really didn't want to change it in any really radical way. I think there are some tweaks which recognise the work that's going on with the community vision, recognise the importance we are placing on partnership working. But I think it's a document that you'll still be able to recognise as very much like the existing plan.
Sorry, so when does so executive sign off in November? So is that going to an executive meeting in November then to sign off? Is that the?
I think it must be if it says it's an executive sign off.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, I'm just trying to clarify or clear up the timelines. I see, is this 2 timelines? So the top line in blue will be the interim and the one that's marked up in red will be the 5-year plan process?
Is that in the final part of your pack?
Sorry,
Yeah,
that's
so
page
top,
31 and 32.
Yeah, so the top timeline is the vision timeline and the bottom timeline is the council plan. What we thought was we put the timelines working together so that you can see actually how they align with each other, so that the vision has chance for us to create the vision, the community vision together, and then obviously the council plan then follows after that. So sorry if that's not clear. So it's the vision at the top and then the corporate plan.
So in that respect, there's no ONS engagement in the 5-year plan in the timeline. Is there an aim to have some in there at all?
I'm quite sure that we'd be very happy to involve ONS in whatever way you would like to be involved. You could add value to this process, I'm quite sure of that.
This may be something we should discuss later and with Chair and see what we come back. Thank you for the answers.
Okay, any more questions from the floor? Oh, Andy.
Thank you, Graham. Can I just check, it's not a statutory requirement, is it? We have a council plan, or is it?
I'll have to defer to Jackie on that, whether it's a statutory requirement.
I was going to say for the council plan, it's not a statutory. It's not a statutory.
Louise.
Yeah, it's Louise. Sorry, it's not a statutory requirement, no. But it is just about setting the direction for the council.
Okay, thank you. So my comments aren't really about the work of the officers, which as always is excellent. It's more about do we actually need it? Because it seems to me that the priorities of the borough are going to be driven by the whatever's in the MTPF and the local plan update. And there might be some strategic things about, for example, the SDLs, but I'm not sure if they come, sorry, the SDLs in the past. I'm not sure if future decisions like that will come out of this. And my worry is that we are doing something that we don't actually need to do, and that which won't make a difference to the lives of our residents. And I was looking back at the older plans, and the 2017 plan talks about engagement with parish councils, the NHS, but it's exactly the same group of people that we said we were going to engage with, that we're talking about 10 years later. Yeah, I just, it's one of these things. I think if you work for a big company, you've seen this sort of stuff, and it just doesn't translate necessarily to what actually happens in terms of what our residents will receive. It will be used, and we were never ever going to be able to go into a meeting like this or to exec and say you can't do this because it's not in the council plan, or you must do this because it is in the council plan. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that is actually, in reality, much more important than this.
Well, you're absolutely right that it's not, no council plan is the be all and end all, because events occur, things happen, and you have to be prepared to respond to those events. So you can't regard a plan as a straitjacket, but it should guide you in terms of what you want to do. I think it's important. I mean, your earlier comments, I'm sure you weren't making this mistake at all, but it sounded as though when you started talking about the LPU that you were thinking in terms of the local plan as opposed to the council plan. Obviously, the local plan, you're saying, influences the strategy of the council in terms of housing delivery. Very clearly it does. And obviously, the medium-term financial plan sets out its financial objectives and constraints. And the medium-term financial plan will play a significant part in helping to shape the council's plan very clearly. But what we're doing here, I think, is somewhat different from what we've done before, because this isn't the council seeking to divine what it thinks the community wants. This is the council working with various stakeholders in the community to create a jointly authored vision. I think that is a different enterprise. And obviously, I think we have to enter into this in the right spirit. And we have to try and deliver what we can deliver. You're right, in the past, there's been an ambition to engage with all sorts of groups, but that ambition has not been delivered. I feel very strongly that we need to make renewed efforts. I mean, you and I have had a conversation in this very room about this before, Andy. I mean, my view is, business as normal, the council just endeavouring to do all that it's done in the past unaided is not realistic. I mean, we are in, as we're going to see under the next item, one of the drivers for that is also a driver for this. We're in really difficult financial circumstances. I would love to think that those financial circumstances will substantially ease and get better in the future. But I don't think we can be confident that local government is going to have a future where money is being thrown at it by central government. Even if there is a change of government, I can't see local government being the top priority for any central government. There's going to be a lot of things that need to be ahead of us in the queue. So I think it's very, very important that we try and think creatively about how we can do things differently. And that, to me, is what drives this and gives extra impetus to it. And that's why I'm personally invested in trying to make it work. I don't underestimate the challenge. I don't underestimate the real difficulties of getting people to work together. I don't even underestimate the difficulties of getting them to agree what the objectives should be. These are all really big challenges. But all I can say is, so far, the environment with this steering group is quite incredible. When I went along to it last week, I was really impressed by how well people were working together, how respectfully they interact with each other. Nobody's trying to push their weight around and get their priorities imposed on everyone else. It really is impressive. It is, genuine empowerment of people. And I would like to see more of that. I think we have to work as a council alongside others to deliver good outcomes for our borough. And I think that's why I'm committed to it.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm still not persuaded. I'm sure people are working together, and it's great. So many people have given their time to do it, but I'm still not persuaded that having the plan is going to make a difference to the way that the council operates. And when I spoke about the LP, we have to do that because that does affect the physical shape of the borough. And I get that MTF, we will get that. But this just seems like something that we can do, something that we would have to do anyway, and then we tack on the bottom, oh yes, because this was in our community vision, and it's almost like a gilding whatever it is we're going to do. Because I'm sure whatever comes out of it will be very noble and fine, but there won't be a budget to it. There won't be officers allocated to it. And I think the changing in how we work with, whatever partners you want to talk about is probably as much to do with our internal culture, and we may find that if our internal culture is much better, we'll find some partners are easier to work with and some which are harder to work with. In that case, they just have to go, well, that it's harder, and we have to focus on the people we can work with. But I don't know that the partnership thing, I think seems to have to come from us. And I just don't, I want to be able to say, I can look at this and yes, it will have this outcome, it will be better for my residents, but I just can't.
I do understand your scepticism. You've expressed it to me on numerous occasions before, so I do understand it. And you're right. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And if I can mix my metaphors, I could end up with egg on my face. But I think it's worth trying. I think it's very well worth trying. You make a really important point about the need for cultural change within the council itself, within the organisation. With the best will in the world, many departments in the council are focused on internal targets, focused on business, core business, and it's tempting in those circumstances not to really devote much time to thinking about how you might work more creatively and constructively with external partners. I can see exactly how that dynamic works. And we are currently undertaking a lot of work within the organisation to try and change the culture so there's more awareness of the vitally important role of these partners. If I can give you an example, and this comes back to a group that historically the Borough Council has not engaged with well. In fact, I'd say has engaged with very badly. That's the town and parish councils, which Graham raised earlier on. The relationship has been very poor, particularly in recent years. And overcoming the suspicions, if I can put it as openly as that, and the scepticism of town and parish councils is no easy task. But one of the things we've been doing is extending planning member training to members of town and parish planning committees so they can come along and get the same training as borough councillors. So that again is a practical thing that's helpful to them, but it also, I think in a very real sense, demonstrates we are trying to establish a relationship of equals rather than the borough council being superior to town and parish councils. This is a token, if you like, of the way we're trying to work in partnership with each other. We also now involve in staff induction a session on the role of town and parish council. So new officers are able to understand, perhaps more fully than some of their colleagues have done in the past, what a pivotal role town and parish councils play as local representatives, local bodies with local knowledge. And they're bodies that we need to work with constructively. There's lots of other examples I could give you of ways in which we're trying to turn the dial on the culture within the organisation to make it better. To be fair, we already have some really excellent examples within the council of departments that work incredibly well with external partners. A very obvious example is one you're familiar with, TLIP. The housing department has fantastic relationship with the engaged tenants. I think you could testify to that, how good that is. So it's about rolling out what we might regard as good practice into those parts of the council where this doesn't come so instinctively and where perhaps the wider public aren't always seen as potential partners, but as seen as people pressing for things that it's difficult to give. So if you think about rules-based parts of the council, highways, planning, these are areas where professional experts with a lot of knowledge and experience are obviously, they have a view on what needs to be done, and trying to ensure that the relationship with town and parish councils for those rules-based parts of the council is as good as it can be is really important. So in summary, I'm very aware of the central importance of the point you made about needing to establish a different culture. And of course, a final point, if I may, partnership working isn't just about partnerships with our external partners. It's about partnership within the council. There's been a lot of, as we're discovering, I think, quite a lot of siloed working. And we need to try and ensure there are really good cooperative relations across the council between departments, so that when a department makes the decision on one thing, it's fully aware of how that might have implications for other parts of the council. So your point is really well made, and I do think it's immensely important.
Pauline.
Thank you. I had a substantive point, but I also wanted to pick up something Stephen just said. I think you've probably overly negatively represented the relationship between parish, town and borough councils in the past. I think it's probably patchy. I've seen some very, very good partnership working, for instance, with Early Town Council in the past, where the borough council handed over a pavilion to the town council, which then allowed the town council to open it. There's been some good partnership working around litter prevention and all sorts of things like that. So I think there are examples of really good partnership working when both authorities look at what's best for the resident rather than worrying about which particular bit of the public purse is paying for stuff. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The other thing is this vision. I mean, there's two ways of looking at this. It could undoubtedly go horribly wrong. It could undoubtedly mean that you get subsumed in pressure groups and that the people who are elected to represent people get sidelined. But on the other hand, I've talked to several voluntary bodies very recently who say the council never listens to them. The council doesn't understand what it's delivering and what they're trying to deliver and when their key dates are. And it therefore is not working effectively with them, and it surrounds them with bureaucracy. So I think this has got a real opportunity to improve the relationship between the council and voluntary bodies so that we really understand what their needs are, rather than just assuming that we understand what their needs are and applying our view of their needs to the problem they're trying to solve. So I prefer to be, I understand what Andy's saying, but I prefer to be optimistic that if we do this right, we can actually do something which is different and improves the life of our residents, which is what everybody's after, really. It doesn't matter whether you're a voluntary body, a town council, a borough council, an officer, it doesn't make any difference. We should all be focused on the one thing, which is the benefit of the residents. It could go wrong, but it could be fantastic. And I'd prefer to be optimistic and think that it actually will improve things.
Thank you, Pauline. Yes, on your last point, I agree entirely. I'm, as you probably have gathered by now, by nature an optimist. You have to be in my position. I really do believe the prize is worth striving for. We may not get there, but I'm going to make all the effort I can to make sure we do. On your point about relationships being patchy, I think that's a fair point. I do think there have been some really good examples in the past of working relationships between towns, parishes and the borough. But I have to say, when we started this process of trying to engage more closely with the town and parishes, there was a good deal of suspicion and a good deal of damage that had been done to that relationship in recent years that needed to be repaired. And we've been trying to do that. I can't say we've got there yet. There's still a lot of work to do, but we are doing our best to blot out past memories of things not going so well and replace them with more positive ideas about what could be done together in the future.
I'd come back on that. I think in some cases, I think it depends a lot on the parish council. But for instance, in Early, you were talking to a completely different set of people last year from the people who actually did the partnership working in the past. So there might be suspicion, but it wasn't based on what actually happened 3 or 4 years ago because none of those people were around. So I think there is good and bad, and I'm an optimist like you. I'd like to look at what's good and shout about it and say this is good and replicate it, rather than focusing on what's bad and shouting about that and replicating that. So I think there's some good things and some bad things.
I'm certainly not shouting about things that are bad. I'm trying to emphasise the positive, and will continue to do so.
Okay, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Slide on page 24 actually gives me a lot of hope. And it's the role of the young people in this consultation, this process. Just because they reach 18 doesn't necessarily say they've got everything screwed up in their head properly and they know what they're going to do. The younger we can involve people in this sort of process, the better it is for the community as a whole for the future, because we're educating, we're involving, we're helping them become community members rather than isolated. Suddenly someone says, there's your ballot, put a cross in the box. So I think this is a really good process, and I'm pleased to see that there is a good effort in involving the younger people in this.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. I agree with you entirely. If this is going to work, we have to engage with young people and get their perspective. And one of the problems is that it's been difficult in the past to engage with young people. And as a result of that, inevitably, you get a somewhat skewed picture if you don't engage with young people and get them involved and get their priorities, which are not always the same as those of older generations, unless you get their priorities reflected in what you're hoping to do in the future. We have got on the steering group a really impressive young man from the Youth Council who is quite incredibly articulate and clear thinking and active. And the Youth Council is organising a logo for the community vision so that we can actually demonstrate that this is something that brings together all of these different groups. At the last steering group, somewhat unwisely, and Jackie will back me up on this, I think, I agreed to visit some of the senior schools to try and promote all of this so that we could engage senior school pupils, particularly their sixth forms, in this work. I've got to do that fairly soon, I think, if I remember rightly, and quite a few schools to go to. So I'm going to have to be very optimistic about my chances of delivering all of this. But your point about engaging with young people is absolutely right. And we must do it, otherwise the plan will not be anywhere near as good as it could be.
Have you found a volunteer bodyguard for the trip to the schools? You're going to need it.
Well, I haven't needed one so far, but who knows? Are you offering? No.
Well, Andy.
Thank you. Just to say that I've also, just last night actually, I was given some very good examples of partnership working by the antisocial behaviour team and Thames Valley Police. The only people who don't seem to have been included in the communications were the ward councillors, which is a little bit nice to find out, even if it was at a different event. And again, it was good to hear about the planning invitation to parish councillors, and sometimes. And that invitation from our planning team to the parish councillors, and to me, is very similar to the engagement I was told about between our ASB team and Thames Valley Police. It seems to me so blindingly obvious that one should do things like that when one can. That I'm just wondering why we need to have a plan to get the most of it. And while we're on the subject of parish councillors, I know the clerks are a great bunch of people, but I suspect. And I am a town councillor. I'm not talking about my parish like at all. No. I suspect they may see themselves as gatekeepers a little bit, and the danger of only engaging clerks and not going direct to the parish councillors, especially in the where most parish councillors aren't borough councillors, is that they may never find out about things. And I'm wondering if part of the engagement should be directly with parish councillors. And if there is other training, for example, I know we've got training on white ribbon coming up soon for some members, any sort of training that we're offering to officers that could be relevant to parish councillors, we should be writing to them directly, because otherwise it's got to go through the clerk and you don't know what else is happening.
I agree entirely with I think all of the points you've made there. When you reflect on it, you wonder why on earth we didn't invite town and parish planning committee members to come to training before. But quite often you don't think of these things until you focus on relationships, and then you start seeing what you might need to do to try and improve them. So if it's something that seems blindingly obvious, I'm afraid it hadn't been blindingly obvious to anyone up until now. So it's this piece of work that really encourages us to do this. Your point about parish and town councillors as opposed to town and parish clerks is a really good one. It goes back to a point, the answer I gave to Graham earlier on, and we've talked a little bit about the challenges of engaging with the towns and parishes. But I suspect, just as we are going to have to go to the schools in order to get a much more broad and representative set of views from young people, we're going to have to go to town and parishes, have a road show, basically. So I'm setting myself up for rather a lot of work, but I think it needs to be done.
To me, one of the important things one has to remember about the town and parish councillors is the majority of them are elected in their own right. So they're not there at the whim of a clerk. I mean, I appreciate many of them are unopposed elections, but they are elected representatives of the people of their area, and we need to perhaps elevate them a little bit more in our thinking as the senior, if you like, body of local government in this area.
I agree entirely.
Okay, just before, okay, Paul, just to stick up for the parish clerks, I think the one way to annoy them is for the borough to bypass them and go directly to parish councillors.
I don't think there's any danger of bypassing the clerks. We have meetings with the clerks frequently, and obviously we want to engage with the clerks as well as the councils as a whole. We would only go to parish councils that invited us. We're not going to just turn up unannounced.
Okay, no, that's right, Paul. No. Okay, so if I could just ask perhaps Jackie or Louise about, because obviously, I mean, I think this committee would be interested in the progress of this project. Perhaps ask at which stage it would be useful for us to invite you back to give us an update.
So I think for the vision, so in the pack, you should have an element of us coming back to, so you've got February 2024. We've got in there a date for us to come back. We can come back before then, absolutely, that's no problem. It's just that at the moment we're in the kind of informal public engagement period, which means that we're gathering information, intelligence, insight, data from our communities in order essentially to put that pen to paper with our partners on the steering group. So we can come back between now and February to give you an update in terms of progress and some of those emerging themes. If you think that would be really helpful, just to give you a steer essentially on what is coming out, although we won't have kind of a final document ready at that point because we need to work with the steering group to do that. But we can certainly come back with the emerging themes that might be helpful for you, and then come back with a draft of the vision it says February here. So yeah, February 2024, we come back with a draft before it then goes out to formal public consultation.
I
was gonna, sorry.
I think that sounds, sorry, Louise. So.
Apologies, Chair. I was just going to add for the council plan that we will do something similar. Obviously, the dates are a little bit further forward with regard to obviously when they're required, because we'll start putting together obviously the first draft of the council plan once the vision is in place. But we're absolutely will mirror what we're doing with the vision, what Jackie's going to do. So we'll make sure that we add those appropriate dates in for the council plan so that you can also see it at draft stage.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, thanks. So probably February then. We'll look forward to that. So just for me to thank, just to thank Stephen and Jackie and Louise for coming along tonight to give us this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So moving on to agenda item 41, WBC future office provision. So I think we have Stephen Conway, the council leader here again, and Sarah Morgan from the property side.
Yeah, thank you, Al. You can see I'm working for myself this evening. So I think colleagues will know quite a lot about the background to this. They certainly, I'm sure, are all now aware of the gravity of the financial situation facing the council. And it's that grave financial situation that has prompted us to examine the opportunity to save money by moving out of our current very expensive to run HQ here at Jute End. With new working methods, meaning that the building is really even a quarter full, it makes great sense to relocate to smaller and cheaper to run accommodation. Various alternatives have been considered and appraised, and at present, the preferred option is to move to 28 to 38 Peach Street, the site at the former Marks and Spencer's building. And this is going to be subject to more detailed feasibility work before a final decision is made. And one of the most important aspects of the executive report's recommendation was the allocation of a sum of money to this feasibility work. But I want to stress that the report does not preclude other options, as you can see on page 39 and page 40 of your agenda. Leasing, rather than using a council-owned property, leasing from a third party, and a location outside Wokingham town will be considered as part of the appraisal process. It will go on alongside the feasibility works on 28 to 38 Peach Street. So other options have not been ruled out. There's a preferred option based on the analysis done of 3 council-owned properties in Wokingham, and on that basis, Peach Street looked to be the best. But that does not preclude other possibilities, and the report does acknowledge that there are other possibilities which do need to be explored. And I'd be very pleased to learn from your committee how you would like to be involved in this as we move forward.
Okay, so we've got questions. Graham.
Happy to kick off. I've been involved in a number of office setups here and abroad. And the thing that seems to be missing for me, we seem to have a cart and a horse round the wrong way. I know that there is financial pressure and all of those arguments and all of the cost-saving arguments that are explained therein. But what we also need to do is work out what accommodation we need that is appropriate for the right staff. There's an example that was discussed in this building, in this room, last month, looking at social services staff. They need to have parking that's close to their office. They need to have places where they can be together, and they've got their own requirements. I'm sure the same applies for the other faculties across the council, and there's none of that in here. So for that reason, I think that this is horse and cart round the wrong way. We need to look at the staffing and the requirements, and then what housing they need. Now, maybe that's a longer term plan, in which case that needs to be declared.
Thanks, Graham. I'm going to let Sarah answer this a bit more fully than I can, because she's been engaged in all the work. But my understanding is we're very aware there are very specific staff requirements, and those are being taken into account in this whole process. Sarah?
And I see Louise hasn't disappeared, so I might bring her in, even if she wasn't expecting to comment. Oh, even if she wasn't expecting to comment. Is that better? Yeah. Just in terms of what we know about the staff, so the two things that have been happening. We have been monitoring staff attendance at Shoot End daily since March 2022. So we have over 12 months worth of data now. That is both total staff numbers, but also which staff are coming in terms of where they're sitting. So we know the proportion that's children's, proportion that's adults. That's not keeping a register, that's just understanding the numbers. We've also done a lot of work with the various services, understanding their demands, and you're right, the particular service or type of work that they do does differ. So one of the reasons when we did the consolidation, where we closed the majority of the second and first floor last year, we worked really closely with all of the services to make sure that they still had the space. So for example, our children's colleagues and adults colleagues who work with information that's particularly confidential and sensitive to the individuals they're working with. So they are in spaces where other members of staff aren't in there, so other teams aren't in there, and then teams which can be maybe more mixed up in terms of the work that they do are located on the lower ground floor. We worked with them to understand their need for breakout spaces, for confidential spaces, places for them to come when they're doing their one-to-ones post if they've been on quite a difficult visit, for example. So we do have a substantial understanding of what the services need. And I would say it's not just me designing this, we are designing it with the services, so it's not us telling them. Parking is, you won't be surprised, you referenced it, is a particular concern in terms of making sure it is efficiently located for people who need to come and go and do their job. So I would, if it didn't come out in the report, there is a substantial knowledge and understanding of how the staff are working and how they want to work going forward. We've been working very closely with Louise as head of HR and her colleagues, looking at what they're looking called the modern workforce policy. So we have staff are working in different ways. Some staff are in the building all the time. They're sort of a fixed worker. We have some staff who are not in Shoot End very often, and they're pretty much virtual. And then we have some staff who are coming and going. And again, that's depending on the nature of their job. Those who are doing site visits, we know that sometimes they struggle to get back to Shoot End in between visits. So they might be ending up having their lunch break in the car or writing up their notes from a visit in the car because they can't get back here. So really trying to look not only at the headquarters provision, but where else can our staff touch down and have space across the borough. So if it didn't come out clearly in the report, I believe that we have a very good understanding and are very engaged with the services about what their staff will need going forward.
Right, Andrew next.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for that explanation. I'd just like to pick up, if I may, on two points. The first is, and this is in direct relation to the issue of staffing needs and so forth. There is a reference somewhere in the report, I recollect, to a staff change group. I'm just wondering, what the role of that staff, what that group is, whether it's been formed yet, whether it will have the opportunity, if the intent is for that group to be feeding in, you know, the kinds of views, needs, and so forth that have been alluded to. I'm sorry, I can't find exactly where the reference to this is in the report. So that's the first point. And the second question is, I can understand, you know, at this, in many ways, it is still a very early stage, but timing is crucial for all sorts of reasons, and I fully appreciate that. So I was a little bit puzzled. On the one hand, I can see very strong arguments for, at the moment, keeping more options open. Hence, the consultants will be looking at opportunities for possibly, you know, leasing, you know, a property from a third party. And I can understand possibly, you know, a rationale, you know, for that. On the other hand, you know, it does that option. And I'm sure that when it's explored, it will throw up, you know, lots of risks and other considerations and so forth. And it's good that we, you know, that they are properly aired and so forth. But I'd just like a little bit more explanation as to why that is being included, you know, in the consultants' brief. And then the final comment that I would like to make, and this is picking up on on Stephen's point. I think it was Stephen's point, you know, as to what the committee would like to see, perhaps, you know, how you know, in terms of involvement going forward. I think that this is another extremely important, you know, area with potential, you know, to achieve a lot of, you know, positives, but also, you know, the potential, you know, to encounter quite a lot of challenges along the way. And for this reason, I would like to suggest that the committee considers almost making this kind of a standing item, you know, for future overview and scrutiny committees. It doesn't necessarily mean that it would be a substantial item, you know, each meeting, you know, but the expectation would be, you know, that there's always the opportunity, you know, for an update, a briefing, and to air, you know, and to air any concerns, initiatives, and so forth that, you know, that are being considered, because I think it is important that overview and scrutiny do continue to be involved very, very much throughout this process between now and I think it's January 27 is the target deadline. So, yeah.
Okay, I'll work my way through, and Stephen, come in if you want to. In terms of the staff change group, that is a group of staff. Whenever we have a program of change that's impacting staff or how they work and how they you know, interact with the organisation, we would always look to have a staff change group. That is a group of people who are independent from the technical process but represent each of the teams or services that are impacted by whatever the change is going to be. This programme will affect every team, every service. So the idea is we have both the technical team, which has about, we're establishing it now, has about 15 different services or teams represented, from car parking to HR to legal across the board. There will then be a separate group of staff, and we will ask for people to volunteer or for teams or start services to put representations forward, and they are effectively the staff sort of well, they're sort of the equivalent of an ONS committee really for staff. They will be where we take things to. They will kind of give us the flavour of the rest of the views of the staff, where people are feeling. They will be our kind of place to go for consultation, and we see them being part of the process all the way through. So that's how we're trying to make sure that, obviously I'm a member of staff, but I have my own views on the relocation, but how we're making sure we're getting everybody's views. And we would look to have that those representatives from across the grades, so not senior management, you know, people who are actually working, you know, in the field, you know, the social workers example that we just referred to. So that's the purpose of the staff change group, as that consultation body. Just onto the next point in terms of keeping the options open. The opportunity for looking outside of Wokingham town and or the leasehold options was something that came through in kind of discussions with other politicians and senior management as to whether this should be an option that we do look at. It's fair to say we hadn't looked at it technically as an officer team until quite recently, and that is why we made the commitment in the paper that we will do that piece of work. It's all we could have sort of stopped the work on the preferred option at Peach Street and said we'll do the leasehold and look outside Wokingham, and then we'll come back and then we'll start again the preferred option if that's where we need to go. Actually, I think doing the two in parallel is quite a positive piece of work, because it means that when we get to the point where that work is concluded, which I anticipate will be sort of early next year, we'll have got further detail, further refined position on Peach Street, and we'll be able to then compare it on a like for like basis with the leasehold options. Whichever way we go, therefore, we haven't lost time. There is an element of it's resource, it's officer time, and potentially some additional money, but I feel that it's a worthwhile piece of information to do, to be able to show that we have clearly considered that as an option and whatever the outcome of that assessment will be. So I feel comfortable about doing the two in parallel. Just on, I don't know if you want to comment, Seaman, on it coming back here, or if you want me to say.
I'm happy for you to say your bit, but I would just like to say in general terms, I think I've spoken before about my commitment to trying to involve overview and scrutiny much more fully in what we might call the overview part of the way the council develops policies. I think I would really like to involve councillors of all groups and non-executive councillors of all groups much more in council decision making. And although in a sense you would be scrutinising the work that's being done, you're also having an opportunity to adopt an overview role of thinking about how you would like this outcome to be delivered best. So I'm very happy to try and bring this back to ONS whenever you think that's appropriate. I don't know whether your view is that you want it at every single meeting. If you do, I'm sure we can comply with that request. If you want it less frequently than that, I'm happy to be guided by you as to what you think the appropriate frequency is. Obviously, we do need to bear in mind that if you want a fresh report done each time, that does involve a degree of officer time that you might argue should be better spent on the work itself. But it is important to keep you regularly updated and to keep engaging with you so that your views can be represented in the outcome. So if we can kind of strike a balance that protects the officers from an undue burden, but at the same time allows you to play a meaningful role, I think that would be highly desirable.
Yes, one thing I would say is when we were looking at the programme, which I'm more than happy to show in detail, we have started to identify where the gateway points are in terms of when a decision from executive will be required, and there are at least 4 of those over the next 18 months. So that might be a natural place for overview and scrutiny, potentially to say in advance of the executive report being written, can we see what's going? And actually 4 over 18 months, it might be a regular enough. Obviously I'll be guided by you, but that might be a way of managing the process and then allows for that scrutiny before the executive reports are prepared. I'm more than happy to share that programme in more detail after the meeting, and you can take a judgment as to whether that's frequent enough. If it needs to be every month, then we can do that. What some things that I would say is some of the information will be commercially sensitive. So at times there may be the need for, if you want to look at that level of information, a Part 2 process, but I can work with colleagues in democratic services when that's the case.
Pauline.
Thank you. I'll make a couple of points. Firstly, to put this in context, I've got no objection to downsizing and removing ourselves from this building and finding something more appropriate. That's absolutely a given. We've had conversations previously. I think the original analysis, which only looked at Wokingham for some reason best known to itself and only looked at council-owned buildings, was a mistake. So I'm very pleased to see that you've extended that. I don't think we should just look at leased buildings outside Wokingham. I think we should also look at purchase, by the way, or sharing for that matter. I think just looking at the requirements, we've talked an awful lot about staff requirements. We need to recognise this is not just an office block. It's a corporate building. It has council meetings and it also requires access to the public. I'm very concerned that we are thinking about it as an office block and not thinking about the requirements of the council building as a whole. I'm worried about, there seems to be no consideration at the moment in this paper about how you would deal with the council chamber. I know you don't need a full-time council chamber, but this paper says it's only used 12 times a year. That's not correct. It's used a lot for large planning appeals as well. I think you need a building that's big enough for a room that is big enough for a full council meeting or equivalent. I didn't see that reflected in here. Maybe I've missed it. We need to understand the value of the buildings that we might be getting rid of. This seems to jump to the conclusion that Peach Street is the best business case. I don't understand that, bearing in mind it's also probably the most valuable building. It looks to me on this paperwork like we're going to spend £9 million in the next 3 years before we generate any benefits at all. So I'd like to know what the payback period is, please. And we need to look also at the costs of this hub proposal. Where will the home base of the staff be? We need to be very careful that we don't end up with a lot of expensive travelling costs because people have a home base of either home or of one of the buildings and spend their life travelling around the place, charging mileage and racking up expensive costs. It would be worse if they had a home base of home, but even if they have a home base of one of the buildings, if they commute between all of them, it could very easily rack up significant costs. Couldn't see that consideration in here. That needs to be thought about as well. I'm not convinced about hubs particularly. I understand the need for services that can be accessed remotely, like, bins or, blue bags or whatever it is, to be maybe hosted in the parish council buildings. And we do that already, but I'm not sure about full hubbing, and I would like to understand how that would work. And finally, there are other buildings in this borough that have in the past had council chambers in them, that they could be worth looking at or sharing. There are large office buildings in Early, certainly, which are probably less used than they were. Have we looked at those? There's lots of things to look at, and I think it's very well worth looking a bit more carefully at all of those. But my first plea is please make sure you get all the requirements and not just consider it as an office block.
I can assure you it's not just being considered as an office block. A lot of work's being done to try and get a better sense of what the needs of an alternative building would be in terms of meeting spaces, public access, and the issue of the council chamber, which you particularly alluded to, Pauline, is alluded to on page 41. It's very clear that we are going to have to try and find an alternative council chamber if we move out of this building, and that won't necessarily be in the building that we move to for office and public access. That's touched upon on page 41 of the agenda. On your concerns about people commuting between sites and your scepticism about hubs, hubs are not an integral part of this proposal. They are certainly something we're thinking about very carefully. I personally think a decentralised approach that is perhaps less Wokingham Down centric would be quite a good thing. It would actually bring the council much more closely into the communities that it's meant to be serving. All of that has still got a lot of work to do on that, and we've still got to see whether it's cost effective. All of those things need to be explored thoroughly before any decisions are made on that front. But it is worth remembering at the moment, lots of people who do come in to work in this office have to commute quite a long distance. It may, in many cases, be a shorter commute if it's actually a hub that's close to where they live. So, all of these things need to be worked through. So the hubs are in the council's thinking at the moment. We are doing a lot of work on this, but that's not really what this at this stage is about. I'm quite happy for Sarah to add anything she thinks is helpful.
Yeah, I think specifically on the issue of the council chamber, and the paper, as Stephen says, refers to that. And I think that the options around the provision of the council chamber and the different ways of doing it will be on the list of the first decisions that the executive will be asked to make in terms of what are the options. So that's one thing that could come here. Before that, we have spent a lot of time talking to lots of other local authorities who all provide their council chamber in a variety of different ways, from a fixed model like we have here to travelling council chambers around boroughs, which has a mixed level of success. So I'm not sure we're going to go there, because those who do it hasn't always been the most successful, or their reports back to another location. So I would like to reassure members that is absolutely on our mind and a priority. I think the other thing, and we talked, Pauline, is around sort of the gravitas of a building and the civic nature of it. And that isn't about sort of lots of portraits on the walls of previous mayors, etc. But it is about the civic nature of what we do and that kind of central location. So I think that is really important and very much in our minds, as well as the working environment that councillors need, the office spaces they need, or the ability to have meetings. But the sort of the nature of a council chamber in terms of its size, how frequently it's used, the IT provision, all of that, the public access, that's really important. So that's definitely something on our agenda to come back on. Just picking up a couple of other points. One of the things about you referenced about values of the assets. We have all of the assets that have been subject to the appraisal so far have been recently revalued this year as part of this work. So we do understand that. The report, we wanted as much of it to be part one, so it gives total kind of cumulative figures, net figures in terms of capital. But we do have behind it an understanding of the current values and what could be released depending on which option that you go with. And again, would be happy to bring that level of information back to this committee in a part two scenario. I don't know, Louise, did you want to come in on staff and expenses and how that
I'll be very
works?
quick, because I appreciate that's not what this is about tonight, but that was one of the reasons I stayed on, was basically just to say that I'm working very closely with Sarah, but obviously from a staff perspective, and that's been happening right from the beginning. As part of this, as she's mentioned, the modern workforce policy that we're working and taken to personnel board runs alongside of this, and things like expenses and those those items will absolutely be covered as part of that, and in consultation again with the staff. So again, we're being clear and transparent about what that looks like for the future.
Thank you. That's reassuring. There was one final question, which was the £6 million cost before we get any benefits. Do you have any idea of the payback period?
Can you just show direct me?
So I've added 3 million, 3 million and 175,000 together. You said it was going to be implemented in January 27. If the current financial year is 23-24, the next 3 million is 24-25. The next 3 million is 25-26. All of those figures are before we get any benefits. So we've got £6.2 million investment. We then get some benefits. What's the payback period?
So that, yes, that process gets us into the new office, which then obviously allows us to, if we were moving out, if the option is moving out of here, then to release this asset. I will need to come back and confirm that to you if I can, Pauline. Can I do a written response? Thank you.
Okay, Caroline.
This is just a quick question. Has there been no commercial interest in Peach Street in buying a commercial person buying it?
Yeah, so Peach Street, so the council purchased it back in 2017, and there was a number of schemes that we worked up, including a planning application was submitted for a gym proposal and then conversion of the upper floors to residential. That deal effectively went away as the beginning of COVID hit. We have had some interest, not in the last sort of 18 to 24 months of people. We are always open and we will always talk to people if they're interested, but nothing that has come through that can work financially or that has come to the table. Obviously, we have forces support in there at the moment operating out of the building, but there are currently no live commercial interests in that building that we're dealing with.
Norman.
Thank you. Clearly, I mean, you mentioned the hubs, but that does have an impact on this, because if you decide to build 3 hubs that take 30 people each, then they would have quite an impact on this. So they are connected, and I think you do need to decide on one to feed into the other. Just start with a question. I have a few points, but just start with a question. You're assuming a supply of 225 desks. What does a normal day in this building look like? What are they? What's the sort of normal? I'll just start with that one question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So our average busiest day is 219. So that's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Mondays and Fridays are below 200 on average. And we have seen that pretty steady. As I said, we count every day. We occasionally have little increases and we can track those. For example, when Ofsted were here inspecting children's services, the numbers went up for those 3 weeks, and you can track it, but we're pretty steady around the 219, and we will continue to monitor that as we go. So that's the answer.
And new staff we're taking on, where is their place of work designated?
I'm going to look to Louise contractually. I don't know if you heard that question, Louise.
I did. Yeah, I did. It is currently still shoot end, but that is part of the changes that we're actually making. We will be making changes to contracts once we've consulted on the policy. Just recognising that obviously we offer a whole wide range of services. One size does not fit all, and this is where the different types of worker will come in, and that's what's being worked up, and that's when you will find different locations will be set for obviously that place of work through that process, and that's what will pick up things like as Councillor Jorgensen picked up earlier around expenses, etc. So being very clear on what our policy will be against each of those worker types.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think we sort of jumped to a conclusion here somewhat. I would have thought that Peach Street and Shoot End are the more valuable sites potentially, whereas things like Rubra 2 or moving to somewhere else, say Winners Triangle, Thames Valley Park, whatever, would be less valuable sites. So I would have thought just on a payback basis, it could make more sense to sell or develop those sites. And if we are planning to move out of Shoot End, what planning processes can we get underway in the short term, I suppose, to make sure that we get best value out of Shoot End. So I think just again a plea to look very carefully at what would be a suitable site Places like Winners Triangle, for example, got good bus, train, car connections, lots of car parking. Just as an example, I'm not saying there, but whereas Peach Street, it's a pretty cramped site. Little chance for much expansion. Car parking for staff and visitors is going to be a problem. There's no doubt about that. So maybe it's not the best site. Things like Rubra 2 and other places could be easier to expand if you need to add on a council chamber, for example. So just those sorts of considerations. I'm surprised you've jumped to the conclusion of Peach Street being the preferred option at this stage.
Okay, thank you for that. I think in terms of the comparison and what we've tried to do, and as summarised in the executive report, is there's both a financial assessment of the options, but there's also what we call a PESTEL assessment, and I should try and remember all of the initials, but it's political, environment, social, etc., summarised in the table on page 44. There's a lot more information behind that, but that is trying to take each option and saying what would be the environmental impact, what would be the socio-economic impact. So, for example, there is a positive impact of retaining your workforce in the town centre. We go out, we spend money, we buy sandwiches at lunchtime, we increase footfall. There's also an attractiveness for staff. Is that as good at being on a business park where there's potentially not so much to do in your lunch break? But an alternative may be that on a business park you can park your car more easily. So they will all have pros and cons, and the purpose of the non-financial assessment is to try and quantify, I guess, those non-financial impacts. And again, more than happy to take the committee through those assessments. And what I'm proposing to do is that the options that we identify through the looking at leasehold or any freehold acquisitions or outside of Wokingham Town have exactly the same assessment, and we can put them side by side, both their financial implications and their non-financial implications, so that councillors can see those impacts. There is not one site that ticks every single box and is the standout kind of winner. It's got to be there will be things to compromise on.
It's a very small footnote to what Sarah's said, which is, as I said in my introductory remarks, no decision has actually been made about the alternative. We are doing that feasibility work, and that includes these other options. So Sarah gave a very full answer about the scope of the inquiry. I hope that will give you some degree of reassurance that the factors you're referring to, Norman, will be taken into account.
Okay, thank you. Just sort of glibly, I'm sure the South sandwiches and other places as well, but I do recognise that if you physically move a place of work some distance, it will affect staff, and you will lose some staff. You will gain other staff, but in the short term, my experience of doing that is that you lose staff, and it does cause an issue. So you do have to take that into consideration. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Adrian.
Thank you, Chair. First question is to Stephen. More of a sort of presentation question, really. I can't see many residents complaining that we shouldn't save money. However, if I was to knock on a resident's door and they said, it would be a shame to lose that historic building, that site, what would we say?
Maybe your experience of knocking on doors is different from mine. I haven't met anyone yet in all of my door knocking, and I have to say it's been fairly extensive over the last 2 years, who's expressed an undying love for Shoot End as a building. I may not have met them, and obviously if people live very close by, they may have a very affectionate view of the building, which is part of the kind of the landscape of the town. And obviously there will be some people who mourn the move if the move indeed takes place. But I think that the number who will feel that this is an appropriate thing to do in the circumstances will greatly outweigh those who might feel some kind of nostalgic pull towards the building and its fabric. I do think it's worth remembering how difficult it will be for us to stay here in terms of the environmental standards of this building really just do not meet current requirements. It will be immensely expensive to alter the building to enable them to meet those requirements. We have an ongoing cost of maintaining this building, which is fairly eye-watering. And in the context of it's only being a quarter full, that really is quite difficult to defend, I think, especially at a time when we are having to reorganise services and we're having to think about all the possible ways in which we can save money. To exclude the estate from that would seem to me fundamentally wrong.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Just a note, a sub-note and a request to this committee, really. I think it's a good idea to separate the capital from the revenue accounting. So, you know, in terms of the maintenance cost, there should be a significant benefit because we won't be maintaining a very out-of-date building. So if those could be really separated, capital and revenue separated in the reporting, that would be fantastic. Next question is for Sarah, which is on page 43. It says the net capital released. And I wanted to focus on the difference between Peach Street and Rubra 2. So Rubra 2 is 8.24 million and Peach Street is 5.47. The difference, I believe, is 2.77 million. So that looks like capital 2.77 million saving in capital. Is that correct? And how do you explain that difference?
Okay, so the net capital released is the difference between the capital cost to convert or refurbish 2838 Peach Street or Rubra 2. So 2838 Peach Street has a significantly higher capital cost investment required in it. It's an old supermarket, for want of a better word, whereas Rubra 2 is currently an office block. It's not the nicest, but it's functional. So Peach Street has a significantly higher capital cost. But if you, but the, sorry, let me work through. So that has, sorry, I'm going to get my numbers mixed up, aren't I? That Peach Street has a higher capital cost. Rubra 2, you would be able to release Shoot End and Peach Street and the old library buildings, and their capital value would be more than the releasing Marks and Spencers instead of Rubra 2.
Super, thanks a lot for that answer. And I just want to go over the Peach Street thing again and kind of echo what Norman was saying. I just can't see that Peach Street is going to have adequate parking unless you put another story on it and make the ground floor a car park, because, you know, if you're talking about 219 people going into an office, how many of those people are going to cycle? How many of those people are going to take the train? And there will be a residual core of people driving, including residents who want to drive in and raise a question or whatever. So I think it would be a massive redevelopment of that building in some way to create more parking so that it would achieve some of the goals. So I have big question marks about that building, frankly. And at this point, I need to sort of declare an interest in that. I live in the town. I'd much rather be in the town. But getting back to the Winner's Triangle point, I know the Sage building is to let at the moment, and that's obviously a much more modern office building, probably even more modern than Rubra 2. Which is of a significant size. So, you know, if you could get a partial lease on that, you could configure that to almost anything you wanted, because I think it's 2 or 3 floors. So, you know, you would take up maybe 40–50% of that. But, you know, it's bearing in mind the parking point that people have made earlier. It is next door to the park and ride. It is next door to the train station. If somebody's commuting to Wokingham, either by train or car, then it would be much easier to get to Winner's Triangle than to Peach Street. It's also next door to Costa Coffee. It's next door to the Premier Inn, and there's a Crown Plaza there as well. So if you have Yeah, and it also makes you know, the officers and the councillors that are from the north part of the borough, it makes the commute much quicker than the Wokingham commute. But you do lose that angle of, yes, people are in the town spending money, etc., etc. But one of the things, so I would really like somebody to consider Winner's Triangle. And then one of the things that I wanted to highlight was, and this is very important because I worked in hundreds of offices in my time as a sort of roving consultant, and there's a very large business not a million miles away from here that has 6 huge offices, and they had a significant incident and wanted to call a sort of Cobra meeting, if you like. And they said, okay, we'll call a Cobra meeting. And they said, right, we need a room to host this. And there wasn't a room on site because all the rooms were limited with fire regulations, et cetera, to like 4 or 6 people. So there was no significant other room set aside for specific eventualities. I would call it a control centre room, but you know, when we talk about specific examples of certain scenarios, COVID was a very specific example where you would need to get different teams and external partners collaborating together in a single room with face coverings or whatever. But also you've got natural disasters like floods and electricity, weather. It could also be the polling station, right? Because you might want also a use as a polling station. So I see a lot of people and they chop up huge offices into tiny spaces and then don't leave one decent sized room where you can have these kind of scenarios. So I would strongly advocate that there's at least one room that's sizable, excluding the point Pauline made, which is, you know, we really do need a viable council chamber. And I agree with Pauline that it's used for lots of things. I notice it's being used tonight. It's used lots of nights. It's not fair to say it's used 10 or 11 times. That's really manifestly untrue, and that needs to be corrected in the report.
Just a very quick comment, if I may. Sarah may wish to add something, but first of all, your point about Winner's Triangle, which is very well made. This is an option that Andy had suggested when we had the leaders' briefing on this, and it is something we are pursuing. It is something that will be looked at. You know, this is a complex piece of work where you have to weigh up all sorts of different variables, and there are going to be trade-offs. There is, as Sarah said, no perfect site, and we're going to have to try and find the least worst, if you like. Not necessarily the best, but the least worst. You were talking about Rubra 2. It currently just does not have the capacity, and we're not looking for additional spend in terms of lots of new construction work exterior to buildings at this stage. But Rubra 2 right now has only capacity for 177, which is well below what we want. And the PESTEL score, which endeavours to take account of a wide range of variables, with those 3 options before it, Shoot End Consolidated, Peach Street and Rubra 2, clearly comes out in favour of Peach Street. So that's not the end of the story, but you know, the work that's been done so far has been limited to those 3 options. And on that basis, that looks like the best option, Peach Street. But there may be other things that were not fully taken into account in that. So, you know, we have the chance in this detailed feasibility work, which is what the executive was really authorising, to be able to address this and address this point about other options that are not considered in this report directly.
Thank you very much for those clarifications. I'm completely with you. I was not advocating, just to set the record straight, I was not advocating Rubra 2. I was there today to drop off some clothes, and there was inadequate parking today. So if we had 200 people parking there and there's no parking there today, it just would not happen. Rubra 2 is a waste of space, really.
Could I just comment just on some of those on the issue of parking? I was heavily involved in the changes to the parking outside here when we did the Elmsfield development, and have dipped in and out of staff car parking for the last sort of 4 or 5 years. I know not only for staff but for councillors and particularly for the public coming in, I know how important that accessibility is. We talked earlier about the need for social workers in particular being able to access quickly. The Marks and Spencer's 2838 P Street does offer us a challenge in terms of car parking. There is the small car park immediately adjacent to it, the Rose Street car park, which is currently a public car park. It will be a case, and this is one of the pieces of work that is kind of top on my list, is how would the parking work if we were at 2838 Peach Street? How would the immediate car park work? How would we look to utilise other public car parks? So we have East Hampstead Road public car parks are the next closest, for example. At the moment, previously, a lot of our staff who don't need direct access to their car frequently have their car parking permits in Carnival multi-storey, for example. So the precedent is already there that they're not everybody has to park immediately outside the front door. So there will, I don't know what the answer is yet, but if I can reassure you that it's absolutely at the top of our agenda, and working with Louise and HR and who needs parking and who doesn't and who pays for it and who doesn't, that's absolutely a really critical piece of work again, which I'm happy to come back on.
Just when you're thinking about that, don't forget contentious planning meeting can easily generate 100 members of the public, all with their own cars, in addition to.
Honestly, we are aware that the council chamber isn't just used for council meetings. We are aware we need substantial sized meeting rooms to be able to accommodate things like a planning meeting that is going to attract a large amount of people there because there's a particular application that they want to hear what the outcome is. These will be taken into account. We're not going to try and shoehorn the council into a building that's not suitable.
I think again, just on the question about accessibility, and if we were in a location that's not Wokingham town, one of the pieces of work that we will do is we will map the accessibility of wherever it is, Winnersh Triangle, etc. So we know we've got all the postcode data, we know where our staff are, so we could map and see how close. We have a good understanding, well, we know the people who have, say, car parking permits, so we've got a good understanding of the proportion of staff that drive to work. We could find out who walks and cycles, same with councillors, and then we can map the accessibility by public transport, etc., of any location for members of the public. So I think because accessibility, I think, will be a really key factor in a future location, I would like to bring that kind of detail back to people to look at that. And just on my last point, just on the council chamber, on page 41, it says for use at full capacity 10 to 11 times a year. That was reflecting when it is a full council meeting, which is when it's at full capacity. I absolutely recognise that it's used for other things, planning appeals, etc. And again, we have mapped all of the times it's used, who's used it, what the capacity is. We've mapped this room and next door and when they're combined. So we have a real understanding of the meeting room demand. So apologies if it's not clear. It wasn't meant to undermine how often the council chamber is used. It was just reflecting when it's at its full capacity, and the full capacity is the bit that we're struggling to re-provide in 28 to 38 Peach Street. We could provide a space that's the equivalent of this room and next door together. And your point, Adrian, about flexible spaces and big enough spaces and not kind of compartmentalizing, and that's quite a key thing about kind of office design in 2023 about those flexible spaces.
Sorry, on the parking point, I have to make one further point. Next door is Woking Medical Centre, which has 25,000 patients, I think. Obviously, people have to, if they're not walkable, they have to park close to there. And I know people have used the public car park. So if that was removed, I don't know where 25,000 people are going to park if they've got an emergency medical situation. And I would be very reluctant, bearing in mind Woking Medical Centre don't let you park on site. They used to, but they don't anymore. So there is no option other than parking on the street, which has got all sorts of ramifications, or that very small car park which is directly next to it. But it's a huge number of people that are registered at that medical centre.
Just to confirm, I wasn't proposing that we were going to close that car park to the public. I absolutely understand that needs to be taken into account, but just for the record, that it's a parking provision needs to be something for us to look at.
It is probably also worth bearing in mind that all 25,000 don't usually arrive on the same day.
However, during COVID, we had to give them large proportions of that car park to permanently restrict them for COVID vaccinations, so they weren't open to the public. So you're absolutely right. If something like that happens again, you'll suddenly find your car park disappears.
If something like that happens again, which God forbid, but if it did, I would imagine there'd be a lot more working from home.
Okay, Chris?
Not for inoculate.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, my leading for that was going to be something sort of similar. I was going to say that there are no stupid questions, just answers that might offend. So I was going to ask, was the car park included in the plan for shoot end, maybe demising, but I see it that the car park is actually really necessary to retain, even if you move to Peach Street, because you could still have staff. It's not a great distance to walk, and they're going to pick up coffee up on the way in. So it's a good spot for the staff to park. And as Adrian says, it's also being used by various other things. So as a retained asset, it makes sense. The other item in there, if I could, it just sorry, Steve, you wanted
to just quickly respond to your point about retaining the car park. Obviously, one of the factors we need to weigh in all of this is making the best use of the current site here if we're going to vacate it, and part of the financial deal in a sense is trying to make sure we get a capital receipt from this site. And if we preserve the car park, that's obviously taking away substantial opportunity for a capital receipt.
I do actually see that. I do see that point. And it would then, depending on what development you got, if it became a development that was going to be housing here for argument's sake, then there's going to be a lot of people want to park their own cars, and this area then becomes a multi-storey option, which is going to cater for whatever activities going on this site and to retain some asset for the rest of the workforce and the community. And the other one that I was going to say in there, that I can't understand where there's a lot of to and fro about saying there's nothing in this document about a council chamber, because at the end of the day, yes, it does say it's used 10/11 for full council. It's used for all sorts of other activities. It's not just sitting in there empty for the rest of the time. And having that sort of replacement facility in something like Peach End is going to be difficult. But I was going to say again, we look at this room by folded doors. You've got the space. You can create the space. It doesn't have to be fixed assets. It can be movable furniture. So everything is achievable. It's just going to be debated because the options are going to be looked at, and we're a long, long way off from that yet. So good things coming out of the conversations. Everybody is noticing the problems that have to be overcome, but we are quite a long way off for actually making decisions about how to overcome them.
That's a very good summary, Chris, and I think some been really helpful suggestions and ideas that have come up this evening, which I think will be really useful as we move forward. I think on that point about being flexible with the use of space, that's immensely important. But I think in terms of where you have a council chamber, that does not have to be in the same building as where you have your office functions and meeting rooms. You could have a council chamber in another property. That's perfectly normal and usual, I think, for other councils. They don't always have everything in one building.
But I think, Stephen, sorry to butt in, the point I was trying to make is the cost of that is not in it. So if you want another building with a council chamber in it, where's the cost?
We don't yet know where it's going to be, but it would make sense to use one of the council's own assets for that function. And then there's no capital cost of acquiring it.
I understand. I just think Yeah, I think you've got part of the paper here, not the whole thing yet.
I think Chris made a very good point. You know, this is the start of a process, not the end of it. We can't answer all the questions because we haven't yet done all the feasibility work. That will flush out, no doubt, questions that even the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee hadn't thought of. So there's a lot more work to do. What we're doing is presenting you with first stage, early considerations of options. We've already acknowledged that we've explored perhaps too few options and we need to expand that. So I do think this is an iterative process, and you shouldn't, I think, leap to the conclusion that you haven't got all the information you need to have yet, nor have we.
I think the thing that causes the problem is the fact that the paper says our preferred option is Peach Street, but it doesn't have the costs in the paper to cover all the costs that would be incurred if you went to Peach Street.
I think the only reason it refers to the preferred option is it's the preferred option of the three that have so far been assessed. That's all. It's unfortunate that the debate has really kept coming back to that, but this isn't the end of the process. We are going to be looking alongside further feasibility work on Peach Street at the other alternatives that have been mentioned this evening and that you and Andy raised in your discussions with Sarah and me earlier on.
Okay, Caroline.
Thank you. On page 51, on option 1, page 41, you've mentioned that you've had consultants, Arabs, doing the work. I assume they've got a written report or an executive summary. Is it possible for us to have a copy of it? And I thought then we could start the process at one of the overview and scrutiny meetings, because there's nothing on the feasibility study, but I think we could start with a baseline. If we could have a sight of this report or executive summary to look at either this management or corporate and well, I don't know, whichever is best, if that's possible, because then I just think we can make a start whilst you're working on it. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I think that's possible. I think out of this meeting, if the request from this committee is that we kind of have a programme where I'm updating, I think what would be a useful start is to share with you the work that's been done to date, which ARUP is one part, but there's a substantial document of work behind that's informed the exec paper. So I think it's the ARUP report, but it's possibly other information as well. I would suggest to give you a full kind of package, but I'm happy to share that information as we go forward. Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's worth saying again, though, Caroline, although we're very happy to share with you the data, it's important to recognise that the ground's already shifting. You've already contributed in ways that mean that the study will be wider than it would have been when Harrop looked at it. So I think it's important not to get too fixated with what Harrop said about 3 sites, because we're now looking at rather more than that.
Sorry, I'm just going to add, I was more interested in what they said about Shoot End and the feasibility of keeping it open rather than the feasibility of the other two, because I thought you'd start with a baseline with you saying that the existing building will cost 5 million. It'd be interesting to have a look at that report and we can have a look at it ourselves. Just the executive summary would be fine to have what I consider a baseline to work from. Thank you.
Yes, I think just to clarify what ARUP did, ARUP looked at the 3 other options, so not Shoot End. They looked at Marks and Spencer's, Rubra 2 and the old library, and they did what they called a space review, where they said, if this is the space, how many desks, what type of collaboration space, meeting rooms could you do? My team then took that information and we have then put that in a much more detailed report as a sort of their work was an input into our assessment. But as I said, after this discussion, if we can agree that sort of programme of work, I'm more than happy to share that, the base evidence that we've got to date for you to start your scrutiny process.
Thank you, I understand better.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you. Could I just ask, I've got quite a few very quick ones, if that's okay, so I'll do them individually. I'll keep mine quick and then you can keep yours quick, hopefully. So the first question is for Stephen. It's really, when this paper came to the executive, because I think this is what we were worried about as a committee, how long did the executive spend discussing it? I missed that meeting, sorry.
Yeah, well, I introduced the item very much in the way I've introduced it this evening. There were some comments from what I can recall. I must confess I don't have a great memory of what was discussed. You would be able to get a better sense of what was discussed if you looked at the YouTube video, because I can't recall. But I can't say there was a long and detailed debate, because I think the understanding of the executive was all they were doing effectively was agreeing the allocation of some funds to do the feasibility work. So in a way, a debate of the kind we've had this evening wouldn't have really been all that fruitful, because it was a relatively straightforward case of agreeing a sum of money to do feasibility work on the basis of the things outlined in the report, not an opportunity to debate all of the things with only a very partial knowledge of what the options and outcomes are likely to be. So I don't think there was a long debate, but I honestly, I can't remember enough to be able to say with confidence what was said by each of those who contributed.
So it just sort of seems to me that if perhaps something along these lines had come to scrutiny first, the ground that has moved that you're talking about might have been reflected in the paper, and there might have been more confidence that the £175,000 was being better spent, because it's more focused.
That's a very reasonable point, and obviously trying to engage overview and scrutiny at an appropriate stage is right, and maybe we didn't quite get the stage right this time, but you know, we live and learn.
Because although the emphasis has been on the current account, the revenue savings, I mean, I keep getting this sense it's actually a capital management program, because the report doesn't include the old library. I don't think Sarah has mentioned it, and I do think it was mentioned in the leaders briefing. And there's this assumption underlying everything that if we do sell Shooten, then we've also got to sell Rubra. And so it seems to me like it's a capital management thing rather than necessarily a revenue saving thing. And then the other, if we are talking about capital management, we're not talking about the other sort of big asset that I know of. I don't know all the assets in Wokingham, which is St Crispin's Leisure Centre, which has a big sports hall. Maybe, you know, it's a council chamber without being called a council chamber, isn't it? Almost. I'm just wondering how much of this is really driven by the revenue savings, because when I look at on page 44, and again I made this point in the leaders meeting, the difference between Peach Street and Shoot End is only £200,000 a year. In the big scheme of things, it's not actually that much. So it seems like we're losing a big. I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there for the time being. I'll come back to some of those ideas in a minute. But could you?
I'm sure Sarah will want to give you a more detailed and well-informed answer than I can. But obviously, revenue saving is immensely important at the moment. It's the revenue budget that's under the most pressure. But a capital receipt will help a great deal with the council's capital programme down the way. So we're interested in both, but we are very aware that we're spending an awful lot of money maintaining a building that's only a quarter full, and that's a key driver to this.
Yes, I think the approach has really been that both are important, revenue and capital, and the real starter for this was, are we utilising the council's existing property portfolio in the most efficient way? And one of the ways that you can make that more efficient is by realising your capital assets, so disposing of the things that you don't need, consolidating into smaller footprint. So that was kind of the real driver. So I would say it's an an equal approach to capital and revenue. One is not, in this scenario, one is not, I think, more important than the other because of just of the nature of the property transactions. For the purposes of this, it in order to be able to do a comparison like for like, the assessment assumes that you will dispose of the assets that you're not using for the new HQ, and that's purely just to enable a like for like comparison. Actually, different things may happen, we may, for example, Rubra 2, we have that has a promotion now under to the local plan for residential development. Now that could be, if we were to we could dispose of it and someone could build it, or we could say actually we'll hold it and use it for our own specialist housing service need, for example. So things will change, and I think that's a really important point as we move through this programme. January 27 sounds a long way away, but it's actually quite a short programme for this, is that we say what were our base assumptions, and then as things change or a service need comes up, we are all kept appraised of that, and we take decisions with that knowledge.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question is I guess more perhaps closer to is actually about civic pride, and someone was telling me the other day that in the 1960s, in order to liberate the car drivers of Wokingham town, a proposal was come up with to demolish the ugly and hated town hall, because it was still hated by people of a certain generation, and to replace it with a roundabout, and that would have liberated our car drivers and freed up a lot of space in the middle of the town. So what is today's ugly building is actually tomorrow's historic symbol of civic pride. And if you think about this part of the town, and my interest is I live very close to the town centre, but I do live even closer to Denmark Street, Peach Street, so that would be an easier walk for me. But if you think about this area and you put more houses in there, however tasteful they are, it is going to wreck this end of town. I appreciate it's a planning thing, but I think one is perhaps underestimating the pride in the area, and how this sort of symbolises what is, after all, the biggest borough in Berkshire. We are bigger by population than any other borough. So, and leading on to that, there's a thing, well, perhaps there is a sort of almost a cost, a community cost, or I'm not sure of the word someone used, but a community cost of having big civic spaces like the council chamber. And there's a reason there isn't another one. And that's because it's a very, very special requirement. It's quite a special place, as are the meeting rooms. So that's sort of a general comment on that. But looking at, you've spoken about the PESTLE review, and I appreciate you've probably got lots of information behind it, but I'm looking at some of the scores and I just don't understand them, and I think they make a real difference. So the table's on page 44, and if we look at the second from bottom, being the best we can be. And it's, I don't know why Shooton's only got, no, it's not that one, sorry. It's not that one, sorry. It is, delivering, that's right, the third one down, sorry, delivering the right homes in the right places. I'm not sure why. Surely this is the best place to have houses in the whole, if one's going down that route. I don't see why it's a 2 and Peach Street is a 5. This is more land than all of those other sites. It's a better location. It's opposite 2 pubs, and it's next to the best playing field in Berkshire, probably. So I don't understand why it's a 2 for new houses and the other 2 are 5. So let's give it a 4, and then suddenly you change the score. Provide safe and strong communities. That's the next one. For some reason, Shooton's a 2, but if we're located 300 yards up the road, Peach Street is a 4. That to me, but Ruva in the middle of nowhere, where there's only a sandwich van, is a 1. I just don't think these scores are convincing. They were the 2 that jumped out. I've got some other scribbles, but I won't. So I think the Rubra, the PESTLE scores are all over the place from me.
Sarah gathers her thoughts on the PESTLE scores. I could just comment briefly on your earlier point about civic pride, which I thought was an interesting and good point, and your point about attractiveness being in the eye of the beholder. I mentioned, I think in the previous item, the Berkshire Leaders meeting, The last one was in Maidenhead, and we went to Maidenhead Town Hall. And as I approached it, I was saying to the council officer from Bracknell, who was on the same train as me, goodness me, this is a spectacularly unattractive building, isn't it? And he said, yeah, I think it is pretty ugly. And I got inside and was told by the leader of the council that the public adored this building, and it was a massive campaign to stop the previous administration closing it. So the eyes of the beholder are indeed something that is very difficult to discern. I come back to the point that I made in response to Adrian. I haven't met lots of people saying we should not move out of Chute End. I haven't met lots of people heartbroken at the concept of moving out of Chute End.
I'm just on that last point before Sarah comes in, people aren't saying that, but they are suspicious. And they are suspicious of what's going to happen to the money, what's going to happen to the land. And Wokingham, I don't know so much about the rest of the borough, but I know from in Wokingham town in particular, it is rife with rumours of past misdoings by the council, most of which, and all of which are nonsense, as far as I can make out. But it doesn't take much to damage our reputation in the eyes of the public. And selling this for even more houses and even more traffic is not going to go down. I don't think there's any way of doing it. And whatever you do to Marks and Spencer, to me it's still the Marks and Spencer's building, it is going to look ridiculous with a flagpole at the front or on top, isn't it? It's just not a civic building.
Well, to go back to the point we've made now repeatedly, I'm sounding like a cracked record. We are not at the end of the process. There are no done deals. There's a lot of work still to be done. The executive has approved the allocation of funds for feasibility work. I think we have to wait and not assume a flagpole is going to be erected on the Marks and Spencer's building. Not assume anything at this stage. I think we've just got to allow the feasibility work to be done, and then we will be able to engage you fully in the process as we move forward. And on your point about public suspicion, I think that's, again, a good point. I think the only real way you can address public suspicion, and it probably won't overcome it, but is being as open as you can, being as open and clear about what's going on as you can. That reduces at least the scope for people believing decisions are being made behind closed doors. That's why it's important that your committee's involved in this process. I think that's probably given Sarah enough time to go through the hassle.
I don't know, Jeffrey, I'll give you the summary, and then I would suggest that maybe going through the pestle scores is a useful exercise that we could do in more detail. But just on the points you raised, Andy, so on delivering right homes in the right places, the scores are if the headquarters is located there. So if the headquarters is at 28 to 38 Peach Street, that enables houses to the Chute End site to be released for residential. So houses go at Chute End. If the headquarters, so it has a high score, because our assessment is that houses on the Chute End site is the right place from a sustainability part of the town. If the headquarters is at Chute End, this site is then not available for houses, maybe up to 100, I think we said in the promotion report, and therefore you've got to find another site for those 100 houses to go. So it's the negative. And then, so underneath, provide strong and safe and strong communities. Rubra 2 is scoring low because if our headquarters is at Rubra 2, our staff are out of the town centre. They're less likely to walk in to buy a sandwich. They're not present here. So that's why Rubra scores negatively or lower, sorry.
What about the difference between Chute End and Peach Place then?
That is because, just check, yes, because that line is also around town centre regeneration. I know it comes under providing strong and safe communities. The view of the team is that finding a long-term permanent use for 28 to 38 Peach Street, which brings footfall, has an economic role, is a really good thing, because to be honest, we have struggled to understand and find a viable long-term use for that building. So it is scoring higher than staying here, because it's a building in the centre of our town that then will have a permanent use going forward. But again, I'm more than happy to, I won't tell you the hours and debates exactly that we've had round the table with lots of people around these scores. So more than, I think, again, that kind of scrutiny process is, very valid.
Thank you. And I have forgotten what I was going to say to Stephen now about his last response. But okay, so my last sort of major point then is looking at the building. We've been doing a lot of work on the Climate Emergency Action Plan, and the only thing we've ever heard about this building is, why can't we put solar panels on it? And then we've been told, you can't put on it. It's too weak. And now we're being told that actually it's going to fail environmental standards in a few years' time. But that has never come out of any other meeting I've been on to do with the Climate Emergency Action Plan. And one would have thought that there was some sort of cross communication, maybe some partnership working between the different teams that would have said, actually, from a SEAT point of view, the borough's building is going to be a big problem for us.
That perhaps takes us back to our earlier discussion on the previous item on your agenda, when I talked about the need for partnership within the council as well as the council with external bodies.
Yeah, I think I don't know who said what at previous meetings, so I don't want to contradict what they've said. But when the piece of work that we've done for this has been, so by 2030, every public building's got to be DEX EPC B, grade B, and so this building is currently at D. And so what we've done is looked at the cost of bringing it up to B. What would you have to do, which is over £1 million worth of investment to get to that point. And then as a comparison, all of the other options, the capital investment, and we talked about the amount required at Marks and Spencer's, has also been to make sure it's as a minimum DEX B. Now, I think there will be a discussion for us to have as to the environmental performance of any future office accommodation. Is it the minimum? Is it our CAP aspirations? Is it net zero carbon? And where does that fit? And I think that's a very valid conversation for us to be having. We have a legislative minimum that we need to meet, but how much further do we want to, could we afford to go? And I think that's will be a specific topic of conversation as we go forward.
Okay, I've got Norman, then Chris, then Adrian. Oh, Chris, no. Right, okay, Norman, then Adrian.
I know you're dying to get in there. Right, we're asked in our front paper to make recommendations as appropriate to the executive. So in the interest of trying to bring this to some sort of conclusion, I think there's been lots of stuff being talked about, and Stephen's made the point that this is at the early stages. Given that it's at the early stages, I would just propose that we recommend that they delete item 2 from their recommendations, which was agreeing that Peachtree is the preferred alternative headquarter location. I think we've heard tonight going to look at more alternatives than that, so that would be my recommendation, that we request that they remove that.
Can I just come in on that, if I may? I understand exactly why you've suggested that, Norman, but I'm not quite sure you can delete a recommendation that's already been approved by the executive. I mean, I think the discussion this evening has already made it, I hope, clear that it was only the preferred option in the context of the choice it was set against. It's not the preferred option necessarily when we consider all the other options that have been mentioned and discussed this evening. So I hope you can just get some reassurance that this is still an open process in which we're going to be exploring other possibilities besides those that are listed in the executive report. That's I think, clear from our discussion this evening. I hope it's clear. So it might be the risk of sounding impertinent and suggesting how you formulate your own recommendations. I'm not sure you can recommend that we unrecommend something we've already approved.
Right. So I would recommend that in considering this, that the executive consider more options, not just this as the preferred option.
Don't think that will be too difficult for us to agree.
So for Adrian, sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, going back to the sort of revenue side of the budget, and Andy's point, there's 200k difference. And one of the things that I was thinking about was Stephen's statement right near the start that there was very significant cost in the upgrading of this building to the necessary regulations for 2030. And you mentioned a number which is 1 million, but I don't know whether I didn't see that number, and I wanted to know that number because I think the summary is just a little bit too high level, and we need a little more detail on what's actually in the numbers. I don't want a massive spreadsheet of numbers, line item detail, but just enough so we can say, okay, this building has this kind of cost, but this building doesn't have that kind of cost, so that we can understand a little more on the financial side.
I'm sure that will be possible, but again, just a quick reminder, if I may, and this again relates to the point that Norman was making. This is the start of a process. The only substantial thing that the executive was being asked to do was approve the allocation of funds from feasibility work. And we've already, I hope, made that clear. The report, in fact, already does make it clear that that feasibility work includes other options.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And one final part, I think we can actually build some lovely properties in Wokingham. Saxon's Court is beautiful, in my view, next to the Ship Inn. It looks a very high quality development, and I think we could do a very high quality development here. But also, we've got members on this committee right now that are members of the planning committee. So, Stephen and Andrew, these guys will be making the decision.
I'm not on the planning committee anymore.
Oh,
sorry. I haven't been since May.
Sorry about that. I didn't realise. But yeah, I'm sure we can. Back to Andy's point, I'm sure we can get some good plans approved.
Okay, and finally, Chris, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Just going back to Norman's comment about 28 Peach Street being taken out. If that was taken out, then it negates item 3. You'd no need to have the money, because that's the reason for the money being voted in the executive, is to carry out the feasibility study, but to include the options, the other options of reviewing other properties, lease options, etc. That's in the body of the document. And I think if it was identified as a key item within item 2, then it would satisfy those requirements. That it's not just 28 Peach Street that we're going to look at. It will be, hopefully there are other properties to look at as well.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think if we can encapsulate what Norm was proposing is that we recommend that all options are still considered. That would everyone be happy with that? Yeah. Okay. So I mean, lots of minutes have been taken. I'm sure lots of notes have been taken about what you said tonight. It's the start of a process. So I mean, what I'd like to say is that we'd like to thank Stephen, Sarah, and Louise. Oh, Andy, sorry.
Sorry, I would like to, I don't know if these guys want to go, but I would like to also make a recommendation that the executive never again accept papers with this level of spending that have not been through scrutiny committee.
Can't hear what you said.
So, my apologies. So I would like a recommendation that the executive never again accept papers that with this level of spending that have not been through scrutiny.
Yeah.
Much as I understand what Andy's trying to achieve, I think he's fettering executive rather too much. If you want to put that in the new constitution when we rewrite it, that's the right place for that recommendation, not from here.
It's a recommendation. I don't think you can fetter. They don't have to accept it, but I think I can't be the only one who's really, really unhappy that a paper that we've managed to sort of raise so many questions about has not been through scrutiny, and yet the executive was already committed to spend nearly £200,000. And it does feel to me like, I don't know if you've been bounced, Stephen. I don't know how long you've had foresight of this. I don't know what the comms has been like, but it feels like to me like we've all been bounced, right, on you guys. The executive has been bounced, and we've certainly been bounced because we're looking at something after the event. So that's the purpose of the recommendation to the executive after looking at this.
Am I allowed to say anything in response to Andy's point? We've not been bounced, and you're not being bounced, because this report, I hope, I mean, I am sounding like a crack record now, but this report, it leaves options open. I mean, those options are there. The feasibility money is not just for Peach Street, it's for the other options. That's actually mentioned in the report. I think we need to try and move away from some kind of conspiracy theory that people are being bounced or pushed to do something they don't want to do. This is an open process. We're trying to engage with you and trying to get your ideas to inform the way we move forward. I don't think the language of people being bounced is all that helpful.
But it does happen, and this is what has happened. Something has been put in front of the executive, and it hasn't been through scrutiny. Now that, and it's not some small thing. It's, as I said, it's only £200,000. The language behind it makes very, very strong assumptions about what is going to happen. And if it had been through scrutiny in advance, it wouldn't have done that. Right now, as it stands, people think it's a done deal just because of the preferred option. And we've heard in this meeting that actually one of them wasn't really an option anyway. So as Chris says, actually it's a choice between here or there. And that's what is written down. It's all very well to, you know, at this stage, there shouldn't be a preferred option. So, which is why I think, I mean, it'd be great if someone could support me to say that the executive should not be accepting papers. That's the recommendation. What they do is up to them. The executive should not be accepting papers that have not been through scrutiny.
The report, if I can avoid being accused of blasphemy, is a bit like the Bible. You can interpret it in lots of different ways. There are parts of it that would sustain your argument, but there are parts of it that sustain mine. It was not written with the intention of suggesting that there was a firmly decided outcome. There is not. I think the question about whether this should have come to overview and scrutiny before it went to executive is a really legitimate one. Although, in my mind, its legitimacy is not based on the quantity of money involved. It's based on the principle of a major decision that really does require input from overview and scrutiny, because this is a significant decision about the future of the council. So I think, you know, in retrospect, I think it's a good case for it's coming to overview and scrutiny before the executive made a decision. But it is worth repeating, as I have done many times now, that this is merely the start of a process, not the end of it. There's going to be lots more engagement. A decision has not been made to do anything other than allocate some resource to feasibility work on options. I think if we don't do that, we can't get anywhere. If we don't agree to allocate resource for feasibility work, there's no way we can assess the different options in a meaningful way. So I do understand your point, and I acknowledge that in terms of the importance of this decision, it's something that overview and scrutiny must be involved in, and arguably should have been involved in right at the beginning before it went to executive. In terms of scale of spend, I'm not convinced that's the crucial issue here.
I'm happy to recommend that we recommend to the executive that they never can accept papers that have not been of this sort, that have not been through scrutiny. We wouldn't expect to scrutinise, for example, the regular items that come up on the agenda, like, for example, the Treasury plan and all those regular ones. But something like this, which is a one-off, there's never ever going to be an initiation to a process that may or may not dispose of our biggest sort of asset. And we find out about it afterwards. We look at it afterwards.
Could I mean, again, this is being very impertinent. Rather than saying this sort, could you say perhaps this significance?
As I said, it's a very significant one, so that then puts it right at the top. So why don't we just say significant? And then
I said significance.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Again, I'm just one person on the committee.
I'm trying in the spirit of constructive engagement between the executive and overview and scrutiny to work towards a solution.
At the moment, nobody else has supported any version of it, so maybe it doesn't go that far. But if anyone would like to support it, that would be great.
Andrew. Oh, right, okay. So, you're proposing that the principle that significant projects come to overview scrutiny
I think that principle is pretty there already. I think this is the onus here is on the executive, to me, to say, actually, no, this hasn't been to scrutiny. It needs to go to scrutiny first. And if that delays the project by a month, then that means officers will have to think about the timelines of what they're doing to allow it to come to scrutiny first. And that's where I'm using the word, the B word, the bounced word, is because the way it was done, it was impossible for it to come to scrutiny. You know, between the meeting that we had as leaders, I mean, as deputy leader at the time, it was impossible for it to go to scrutiny, and that always leaves a bad taste, and especially with something as big as this.
Well,
Is there a second?
Is there a second?
Yeah, okay. Is there a seconder then for Andy's proposal? Oh, Chris.
Actually, I would second it on the principle that yes, the scrutiny should be aware of activities like this going on. But the question I would ask that goes with that is, what figure do you put on a level of something that is considered to be significant? That is the problem I have. That's the only problem I have.
Are you seconding Andy's proposal?
On Andy's principle, yes, I am seconding it.
And I would take the figure out and just leave it on the principle that I think the executive has a bigger role here for me to sort of say, no, actually, we're not comfortable with this coming to us before it's been scrutinised.
Okay, so can we have votes in favour of Andy's proposal? Okay, against. Okay, that's fallen, but it is a very good point. So so I think we
just to clarify, Chair, then there's one recommendation about the other options being considered, and is there a second recommendation about agreeing a time frame for it to come back to this committee at appropriate times?
I would suggest that we do need to know when would be the appropriate time for this to come back to this committee.
Yeah, the first gateway, when I anticipate there will be decisions to be made, we will aim for either February executive, will probably taken up with budget, so it'll probably be March executive. But there were a number of questions and things of detail that either we sort of come once with lots of information, which I don't know how the committee would feel about that, or we could come a few times or a couple of times with smaller bits, like things like, like parking or the pestle scores. They could take, I don't know how much time the committee wants to spend, but they could take quite a lot of time. So, but I would say probably the other side of Christmas is probably the right time when we'll have the leasehold assessment work done, etc. That would be my recommendation.
Adrian?
Yeah, I think the gateways you mentioned 3 or 4 gateways, that would be perfect. I don't think we need to queue everything up and have one massive drains up on this. We need a certain level of detail. I think it's just a little bit more detail than we got this time. Would be great. Thank you.
Andrew?
Yeah, could I suggest that between now and the next meeting on the 15th of November, that we meet with you, that the chair and the vice chair meet with you, Sarah. We take a look at the gateways and come with a proposal to the 15th of November meeting as to when appropriate timings would be for specific items relating to this. Yep.
Yes, that would be fine.
Norman?
Sorry to prolong this, but how much more information will we have available during the budget process? It seems to me that we might not have much more by the time we set the budget, because we will be scrutinising the budget over the next sort of 3-4 months.
So there is a capital bid has been submitted for next financial year and the year after, based on the costs associated to go with 2838 Peach Street and works associated with that. Those costs will need to be refined with part of the work, but they will also need to be updated if actually 2838 Peach Street doesn't turn out to be the preferred answer. But we need to have something in that budget setting process now, almost as a marker, and that is the most realistic number. So the process will get scrutinised through this process, but it would also get scrutinised through the budget setting process as a capital bid.
Okay, so we agree then that we're recommending that the options remain open, and that secondly that Andrew and I meet with Sarah to work out a time frame for future appearances at this committee. Is that and also to thank Stephen and the officers for their presentation today.
I would like to say thank you very, very much. I know it's never perfect timing, but we really appreciate you coming and giving us really strong answers to the questions. It was very informative from my side, at least. Thank you very much.
So can we have a show of hands for those recommendations? Okay, good. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Okay. Agenda item 42, unauthorised encampments update, and we have Narinda online to tell us about this.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. The paper in the pack, hopefully everybody's had a chance to read through it. So just as a really quick overview, I'll take you through sort of the main highlights of the paper in the pack. The committee's requested an annual update on unauthorised encampments, and the paper sort of gives an overview of the numbers that we've had so far for 22-23 this year. So as the paper says, we've had 5 unauthorised encampments this year so far, notwithstanding that we've got 3 months of 23 left until the end of this calendar year. The average number of days that the 5 encampments have stayed is 4, compared to 20, which was last year's sort of average. And that, as the paper indicates, was swayed greatly by one encampment in particular in 22, which stayed for a number of 90 odd days in relation to one particular encampment. The paper outlines that Woodley is the sort of hotspot in terms of the number of unauthorised encampments that we've had. So 4 out of the 5 so far this year have been in the Woodley ward, and the total cost so far this year in terms of unauthorised encampments and dealing with those has been just over £8,800. The paper also takes through the operational management changes that have occurred this year in relation to dealing with unauthorised encampments. So that operational management has moved from the Housing Services Department Directorate over to the Antisocial Behaviour Team, which was conceptualised on the 1st of April 22. And the team now have taken over the operational management of dealing with unauthorised encampments, which is a 7-day-a-week service. So expanded on the 5-day-a-week ability to deal with the encampments, unauthorised encampments, changed on the 1st of April 2022. The report also takes you through sort of the common law powers that are used currently, which utilises bailiffs. And the sort of efficiency in terms of utilising bailiffs and the speed at which the unauthorised encampments can be dealt with in terms of utilising this method, and also the sort of welfare checks undertaken and the various different checks undertaken, including welfare checks in terms of dealing with encampments that land across the borough. In the paper is also an example of some good practice that the team have developed in terms of dealing with encampments in relation to working with town and parish councils. In the main, it talks about the sort of good practice example there with Woodley Town and Parish Council, and that's something that we're looking to sort of replicate where required around the borough in order to ensure that unauthorised encampments are dealt with efficiently and effectively, as we're currently undertaking, the team is undertaking at the minute. And then just as the sort of the end of the report also outlines the number of pitches that have been delivered and completed as of the end of September 2023. So gives an update with respect to that within the report. And with that, Chair, I'll happily take some questions.
Okay, Andy first.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for staying up so late, Narendra. The Wokingham one is one out of date, because I think there's an encampment at the moment in Norris Ward, but it is being all the details are with your team, as I'm sure you know. Okay, I was just wondering about the pitches. So with the Carter's Hill, it says that planning permission was given for 3, but they weren't completed due to expiry of the planning permission. And I was wondering, is that a Wokingham Borough site, or is that a private site? And there is a further one. There's actually 3 questions coming out of this. So there's also, I think it's called Cart Ref Farm. I've not heard of that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, obviously. And that one wasn't implemented either. And my third question on this part is, so I've actually got 2 more questions. One is, have you got any sense of the usage rate, or I don't know, or the occupancy rate of the sites that we do have? And these numbers seem very, very small. Is there like a minimum size or a maximum size? Are they seen as viable? Because if you're normally travelling around with, say, I don't know, 4 caravans, and the sites are 1 or 2 sites, you're not going to get very many people wanting to stay there. So I'm sorry, there's a lot going on in those 3 or 4 questions.
Yeah, so thank you. I think in terms of the ownership of the sites, I will I'm going to have to refer back to you sort of in writing unfortunately, because I don't have that information to hand, and I'm able to do that. In terms of the occupancy rates, I am informed that they are very well utilised. Is the phrase that I believe is used. But I can come back to you with a full and comprehensive rate of occupancy in writing in the same question and answer, if that's okay, in a written response.
But thank you very much. And so leading on from that, we in the past we've been told that one of the reasons that travellers prefer the Reading fringe, if you like, say Early and Woodley in particular, is because of the proximity to the Royal Berkshire Hospital. And with that in mind, and given that is always going to be a draw for people, because if you want to have a baby, obviously it's good to be close to hospital. With that in mind, is there going to be any provision in the local plan update for additional sites that are more geographically sort of convenient, rather than, for example, Carter's Hill, and you couldn't get much further from the Royal Berks if you tried, frankly. So that's my second question. Is any provision going to be made in the local plan in terms of sites on that side of the borough?
In relation to the local plan, I believe that additional sites are being considered, but none that have been identified in relation to that side of the borough is again the sort of information that I've got. So yes, broadly sites are being considered, absolutely, as you would expect, but to my knowledge, none on that side of the borough, unfortunately. Due to none being identified as opposed to not being considered. So none have been identified, I should clarify.
And is that something that anybody in particular is looking at? Because it's one thing to have, well, to me it seems like there's one thing to have sites, for example, in Carter's Hill, which isn't the side of the borough people want to be on. So is there anything being done to look at more sites in that area?
It would probably be best if I come back in writing, because that is a combination of work being undertaken by both housing and planning colleagues, as you'd expect, in partnership with them. So currently none that we're aware of, but I will ensure a comprehensive response that brings into sort of the current work being undertaken by housing and planning to ensure that is comprehensive for you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Andrew.
Yes, thanks, Narinda. I was also going to ask about site provision in the local plan update, so thank you for sort of introducing that topic. My question relating to that, though, was specifically on provision of transit sites. And do we have any transit sites currently, in the borough? If not, is this something that is actively being looked at? The second question is a completely different track. I think it's probably addressed in the welfare checks section on page 52, but just to settle my own mind, your report says a welfare check is undertaken for each and every unauthorised encampment. Can I just confirm, firstly, that is for all unauthorised encampments, whether they are on WBC land or privately owned land, and the scope of the welfare check? So there's a reference, for example, to pregnant women, but there are, of course, potentially a lot of other vulnerable groups. So there could be vulnerable adults who are elderly or frail, persons with learning disabilities, and so forth. So my question is about the scope, of the welfare check and who precisely carries these out. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll take the question on the transit sites first. Do we have any? No, not at the moment. Have we explored them? Absolutely. Will we continue to do so? Absolutely as well. I think transit sites has been identified as one of the key ways of sort of perhaps being one of the problem solving abilities in the toolkit for unauthorized encampments. But in short, the answer is no. We don't have a transit site in the borough. In relation to the welfare checks, to provide some reassurance, absolutely every single unauthorised encampment, regardless of whatever land they land on, in terms of encamping, a welfare check is undertaken. It is full and comprehensive in that all health needs are explored, and a range of them are explored. So that sort of list that you've identified there in terms of a range of different health issues are considered, not just in relation to females and pregnancy. So, for example, where COVID was of prime concern to us, that was amongst some of the sort of screening questions and questions that are undertaken. So full welfare check is considered. And then the officers that undertake the initial welfare assessment and questions, if there are some identified issues, then those issues and concerns are passed on to healthcare professionals to undertake any additional healthcare assessments or needs that are identified in the primary assessment.
Thank you very much. That's very reassuring. Thanks.
Any questions for anyone else?
I was just going to say, sorry, I didn't make it clear when I was talking about extra sites. I was referring to the transit sites, and in particular the need for them on that side of the borough rather than the residential sites. So I guess there's been no work done on those either.
Yes, and my previous answer is also applicable to that as well. Yeah.
Okay, Caroline.
It's just following on from Andrew's question on welfare. If we find somebody is in serious need, do we go back again and check up on them, or we just signpost them?
I think to provide reassurance again, if we find somebody in serious need, it would depend on what the need was and whether we would actually be, as in the officers attending, would be the most appropriate officers to actually follow up on that need. Again, we will go back, of course, regardless of whether appropriate or not, but we will absolutely also signpost, make referrals, and do whatever is necessary in terms of ensuring that access to required healthcare professionals is undertaken.
Norman.
Yeah, I mean, it seems from the figures that you've given us that the intervention by our officers, the ASB team now, and the use of the bailiffs especially seems to have brought about a resolution of these illegal encampments quite quickly, which I think is a reassurance to the residents. So I think it's good work in achieving that. Thanks.
Yeah. I think thanks to the whole ASB team for their work. Oh, sorry, Chris.
My apologies. Page 50, where we have the breakdown of how many unauthorised encampments has been over the various years. Is there any indication of which months these occur, so to spot a trend?
There is, and we as a team monitor that. We know from the data that encampments, unauthorised encampments, usually start, and some would be weather dependent, but usually start around about March, late March through to September normally, although I appreciate that we're in October at the moment and we have just had an unauthorised encampment land currently today. So we know from previous years' data that is really our hot months, which is really from the spring and summer, where it's not unusual to have them outside of that period, but the majority of the activity occurs between March and September, it's true to say.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we just note this report and thank Lorinda for producing it and
Staying up so late.
and staying up so late.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. I'll be sure to pass your thanks on also to the ASB team.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.
Okay, so T3. It's a future programme. So draft work programme. So I was suggesting that because the St Crispin's report is coming to exec at the end of November, that we ought to, before that, have a look at it. Sorry.
I said there's no need, it'll be fine, I'm sure.
So that was my suggestion for November. Andrew, sorry.
I think if in view of what was agreed earlier tonight, if we could also add for the 15th of November that we will feed back potential dates for discussing the possible move, of the HQ. So it's not a full agenda item as such. It's simply, what the results of our deliberations were. Suggestion.
Okay, and so so for next month, I think the WBC recruitment and retention, I'm not sure that's going to be available anyway. So if we put some Christmas in there and as Andrew said, our feedback. Is there any for the following any particular comments on any of the following months? Andrew?
Yeah, I wasn't aware that there could be an issue with the recruitment and retention agenda item, but has that been confirmed that it's not likely to be available then? And if so, I think the reasoning, the reason why this item was asked for was because some of the overview and scrutiny committees, such as Children's Services, are looking at these matters specific to their areas. But I think this was the intent here was to have a sort of a more council-wide sort of overview. So it's not something that I would like to see dropped as an agenda item.
Okay. Oh, Norman.
I'm just thinking the agendas for 16th of January, 6th February and 6th of March, quite full of things. And if we were to take anything like the amount of time we took per item tonight, would be until about 3 o'clock in the morning.
So it's a movable feast. So we'll look at it close to the event, and obviously we'll get an appropriate number of items, not too many.
Good. Okay, so any,
I mean, for example, do we know if Thames Water are going to come in January? Have we got that confirmed yet or not?
I'm still trying to contact them. I think we might have scared them when they came.
We were quite nice, really. I thought.
so any comments or
Services next.
yeah, children's services, any comment on children's services? Andrews.
No, the version that we have in front of us is the latest version. We just updated it a week or so ago, so that's fine.
Climate emergency. No.
Oh, sorry, Chair, there is one thing, I think this might be the right point to bring it up, is that in our last climate emergency meeting, it was raised as an issue that perhaps as the Barkham solar farm progresses, that the question was, would it fall within just the CAP committee or would it go somewhere else? So for example, if you're looking at, say, the day-to-day operations or the finances of the farm, should that stick within CAP or should that actually go to corporate and community? And my view is building up sort of expertise in the committee, and because it's on the agenda every month, we should keep it. But some of the members did want it raised for discussion like overview and scrutiny management to decide where the future discussions about the farm would take place. So I'm doing that now.
So has anyone got a view on the solar farm?
Yeah, I'm agreeing with Andy on this, that there comes a point as the solar farm deployment progresses, so the responsibilities and interests move into planning, into management, into highways, vehicle management, deployment, etc. So it's a moving fest as who has or needs the most up-to-date information about how that project is progressing. Once it kicks off, yeah, the focus changes, but it's deciding where it goes and when it goes.
That's not agreeing with me. That's disagreeing with me. But yeah, you're disagreeing with me. See you outside. I'll see you later. So no,
Sitting outside.
Yeah. No, I think the transport management plan is one piece which we've sort of hived off to corporate. But in terms of the general sort of saying 5 years time, is it really part of the plan? Because 5 years time we'll be on the next version of the plan. Is it part of the plan or not? That's the issue.
Okay, Norman.
I would suggest for now it stays with the Climate Emergency Overview and Scrutiny Committee. As Andy says, that committee is building up an understanding of it, and the measurement of performance and meeting targets probably is most important to the Climate Emergency Committee anyway. So I suggest it stays there for now.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, is another committee particularly want to take it on? That's the. I mean, I would agree that whilst it, it is primarily in climate emergency. I mean, I think it should stay there. For, would be my view. I'm not. I'm quite happy for it to stay there.
I agree, but I said I would bring it to this place.
And doesn't see much disagreement, so good. We'll say it stays there. Corporate and community. Anyone? Any comments? Chris.
Yeah, it's a comment that we're talking here about. Actually, it's just a shame that Callum's name's still on the documents. Callum's name is still on the documents as a contact officer.
Oh, right, okay.
This just needs an update for that, really.
With corporate and community, one of the things which did come out of the climate and the last CAP meeting is that that there are several major developments likely to happen in that area. So you've got the solar farm, you've got California Crossroads, you have extension to Bow Hunt School, I think there may even be 2 SEND schools coming down there, and there are two other big planning applications, but I don't refer the 2 SEND school applications. But the sense of the ward members for that part of the borough was that there's going to be a lot going on, and they wanted community and corporate at some point to bring in to make sure they had an overall view of all of the transport plans, because each of these developments will have their own transport plan. But if they aren't coordinated and synchronised, it's going to be a problem. Now, the officer said they would be, but I think members really wanted reassurance, because if it goes wrong, then it's going to be a big chunk of the borough which is affected. So that's the only thing which is missing from this. Maybe that Neil hasn't got around to updating it. I'm sure he's all over it.
Okay, so we note that? Yeah, yep, right. And health, any comments on the health agenda? No, good, right, okay, and then agenda item 44, the action tracker. Is there any comments on the action tracker?
Again, I'm not sure if this is the right, I should have brought it up in an earlier section, but it was just going back to the sale of Shoe End, that Sarah said that they would have to put something in the budget, put a growth bid in the budget. Now, when we vote on the budget in February, presumably, once we voted for it in the budget, that's going to be taken as sort of tacit assent to whatever happens. And I'm not sure our scrutiny arrangements really account for that. But it took me a couple of seconds to process what the longer term implications are, that by having it in the budget and you vote for it, then you don't have an argument against it at a later stage. I will communicate that to Stephen separately, but I'm not sure where it fits into it. But I just wanted to say that.
Doesn't corporate and community look at that as part of the MTFP budget process?
But I'm thinking in terms of the approval process, is that once it's in the budget, it's almost like a commitment. So it may be, for example, I never want to vote for the sale of Shoe End. However, if it's in the budget, my voting for the budget, or any members voting for the budget, will be taken as assent to what has theoretically not been decided.
Paulie?
That was a conversation we had at OB and Scrutiny Management Committee yesterday, Monday, I can't remember, was it? Committee and Corporate, was what are the triggers for approving spend? And Graham said either the MTFP, exec, or full council. I think, although having seen the mess that they got into with litter bins, where I think somebody took it being in the budget as okay to just get on with it without going through any approval. I think there is another level of approval on spend potentially, but I do think we need to be really clear about that, because I think people can have different interpretations of things being in the budget.
I think it will be how it's described and worded in the capital bid, and then going forward, so we can definitely make sure that it's worded appropriately, bearing in mind the conversation this evening.
Right. Sorry,
but yeah, it's along those words of a reserved rather than a commitment. A statement in there that says it's a reserved possibility rather than a commitment to spend, so that if the project doesn't kick off, if that something doesn't kick off, then that comes back in as it would anyway with a capital expenditure. If it's been reserved for that purpose, it's ring fenced. But if it's not used, if the project doesn't kick off, it comes back into general funds.
I think Andy's point is that by February we won't know what the scheme is, but there'll be an amount in the budget. So it's tying those two up, so that we get the chance to review what the detailed plans are, which are going to be sometime next year.
So if it's not in the budget in the first place as a reserved item, then there's nothing there for the project to go ahead with if it suddenly kicks off halfway through the year. So it needs to have some funding statements, but such that it is for that purpose. And if it doesn't start, not that it's agreement that it can be used for that purpose anyway, but it's there in case that purpose materialises because it's on the agendas.
So that's not strictly
think-
true.
I think-
You can put
I think what
overlays.
what we're saying, I think, is okay. It's there in the budget. It's represented in the budget, but we'd have to have a statement with it that's subject to further approvals or whatever.
But should we,
Or you could put a special item in later on in the year, which can be done. So once you've got to a conclusion on what the answer is, then you put a special item in to cover that answer, which is a safer way of doing it.
should we leave this to corporate and community? I mean, they're going to be scrutinising the budget. I mean, these are the questions that should be asked.
And if Neil takes that away with that conversation about when it appears, how that's worded, and that's put in front of us to make sure it's happy. Yeah.
Okay, so we're all happy. We'll call the end of the meeting.
Terrible use of language. Right?
I'm sorry, Stuart, it's slightly longer than I said.